Humans have been scaring themselves silly for thousands of years. Every culture on Earth has its own collection of things that go bump in the night, slither through water, or breathe fire at inconvenient moments. Comment below what time you're listening to this madness. Misery loves company. You're about to discover that every monster under your bed started as someone's very real, very bad day. But none of these creatures just popped out of thin air. Behind every legendary beast is a perfectly reasonable explanation that somehow got twisted into something far more interesting. You're about to walk in the footsteps of the people who first encountered these monsters. You'll see what they saw, feel what they felt, and understand exactly how a perfectly normal day turned into a legend that's still terrifying children centuries later. Ready to ruin every fantasy novel you've ever enjoyed? Let's begin. Part 1. Dragons. You're a farmer in ancient China, minding your own business when your plow hits something hard. You dig deeper, cursing whatever ancestor buried their junk in your field. But what emerges isn't pottery or old coins. It's a skull the size of a wine barrel, filled with teeth that could crack a man in half. You are Zhang Wei, a practical man who believes in practical things. Rain falls down, not up. Chickens don't breathe fire. Dead things stay dead. But this thing staring back at you from the dirt challenges everything you thought you knew about the world. The skull is longer than your arm. The teeth curve like sabers. Whatever this belonged to could have swallowed your ox hole and asked for seconds. Your hands shake as you brush away centuries of soil. More bones emerge. A spine like a ship's keel. Ribs that could cage a horse. Leg bones thick as tree trunks. You've never seen anything like this, but your grandfather's stories suddenly make perfect sense. He spoke of great serpents that ruled the earth before men, creatures so mighty they could command the very heavens. You always thought he'd been hitting the rice wine a bit too hard. Now you're not so sure. The village elder examines your find with the solemnity of a man who's seen too much. He nods slowly, as if confirming something he's always suspected. Dragon bones, he declares. The old ones spoke truly. You want to argue. You want to point out that dead things don't just grow that large, but the evidence is literally staring you in the face. And frankly, dragon makes more sense than admitting you have no bloody clue what this thing used to be. Word spreads faster than fire in a bamboo forest. People travel for days just to see your discovery. They bring offerings as if the bones might wake up and demand tribute. You start charging admission. Why not? If people want to gawk at the remains of heaven's former landlords, they can pay for the privilege. But you're not alone in your discovery. Across the world, other farmers are making similar finds. In Europe, they call them the bones of saints or giants. In America, they whisper about monsters from before the flood. You don't know it yet, but you've just stumbled across a protoceratops, a herbivore about the size of a large dog that died 80 million years ago when this land was a very different place. But try explaining that to someone who's never heard of evolution, geology, or the concept that the Earth might be older than his great-great-grandfather's stories. The bones get larger with each telling. The teeth become more numerous. Someone swears they can see scorch marks on the skull where it breathed fire. Another claims the skeleton was found clutching a hoard of gold. Within a generation, your simple farming accident has become the stuff of legend. Poets compose verses about the mighty dragon that once terrorized the land. Artists paint scrolls showing winged serpents battling heroes with more courage than sense. You die a wealthy man, having turned one confused afternoon into a lifetime of tourist revenue. But your legacy lives on in every dragon story told from that day forward. The truth is both simpler and more amazing than anyone imagined. Millions of years ago, this land teemed with creatures that would make your fictional dragons look like house cats. Real monsters roamed the earth, fought epic battles, and died in ways that would make Hollywood weep with envy. But you couldn't have known that. You were just a farmer who found some very old bones and did what humans do best, told a story that made sense of the impossible. And somewhere in a museum today, that same skull sits behind glass, labeled with its proper scientific name, Visitors walk past more interested in the gift shop than the miracle of deep time preserved in stone. They have no idea they're looking at the inspiration for every dragon that ever terrified a child or thrilled an adult. They don't realize that what started as one man's agricultural mishap became the foundation for thousands of years of mythology. But you would understand perfectly. After all, you were there when the dragons were born. Part 2. The horn that launched 1,000 fairy tales. The dragon bones were just the beginning of humanity's talent for turning perfectly normal things into absolute nonsense. You're Magnus Eriksson, a Viking trader with a head for business, and a complete inability to tell the truth when a good story will make you richer. The year is 1203, and you've just returned from the most profitable voyage of your career. Your ship's hold contains what might be the greatest treasure in all of Christendom most, or the most expensive lie you've ever told. Either way, you're about to become disgustingly wealthy. The object in question is a spiral horn, longer than a man's arm and twisted like a unicorn's horn from the illuminated manuscripts. Except this one is real, solid, and absolutely guaranteed to make every nobleman in Europe empty his treasury. You acquired it from an Inuit hunter in Greenland, along with a fascinating story about the whale it came from. But you're not about to tell anyone that. Where's the profit in honesty? The horn sits in your cabin, wrapped in the finest silk you could afford. Every time you look at it, you see gold coins dancing before your eyes. This single piece of carved ivory is your retirement fund, your children's inheritance, and your ticket to a life of luxury. You dock in London to find a city obsessed with purity and magic. The church preaches about miraculous beasts that serve God's will. The nobility collects relics like other people collect fleas. Everyone with 2 coins to rub together wants something that proves they're closer to heaven than their neighbors. Your timing couldn't be more perfect. You present yourself at court as a humble merchant who's stumbled across something extraordinary. The horn, you explain with practiced sincerity, belonged to a unicorn that appeared to you in a vision. It spoke of the need to find a truly pure soul worthy of its sacrifice. The story gets better with each telling. The unicorn becomes more magnificent. The vision becomes more detailed. The sacrifice becomes more noble. By the time you're finished, you've practically written the creature's autobiography. King John examines the horn with the reverence of a man handling the crown jewels. He's heard the stories, of course. Unicorns only approach virgins. Their horns can detect poison, cure disease, and grant eternal life to the righteous. This is exactly the sort of divine endorsement a king could use, especially one whose reign has been somewhat lacking in divine endorsements lately. The negotiations are brief but profitable. You walk away with enough gold to buy your own kingdom, leaving behind a horn that will become the centerpiece of royal ceremonies for generations. What you don't mention is that your unicorn horn came from a narwhal, specifically a male narwhal, whose tusk grows in exactly that spiral pattern. The Inuit hunter who sold it to you was probably having a good laugh about the strange foreigner who paid so handsomely for something they used to make tent poles. But your customers don't know about narwhals. They've never seen the Arctic waters where these tusked whales live perfectly ordinary lives, occasionally losing their horns to hunters or fights with other males. What they have seen are rhinoceroses, brought back from distant lands by explorers with more courage than artistic talent. A one-horned creature the size of a small house, aggressive enough to charge armed knights, and definitely not interested in purity of any kind. The descriptions get confused in translation. The horn gets moved from the nose to the forehead. The grey hide becomes snow white. The short, stumpy legs become graceful like a horse's. The violent temper becomes a gentle nature that only responds to innocence. Add a few centuries of artistic license, some Christian symbolism about purity and sacrifice, and suddenly you have the unicorn, a creature so far removed from its rhinoceros inspiration that they might as well be different species. Meanwhile, your horn sits in the royal treasury, occasionally brought out to test the king's wine for poison. It never detects any, which everyone takes as proof of the wine's purity, rather than the horn's complete inability to detect anything. except the gullibility of its owners. You retire to a lovely estate in the countryside, where you tell anyone who'll listen about your adventures in exotic lands. The unicorn story has evolved considerably. Now there were 3 of them, all speaking in perfect Latin, delivering prophecies about the kingdom's future. Your grandchildren love these stories. They have no idea their inheritance came from convincing the most powerful people in Europe that whale tusks were magical horse horns. But you sleep soundly, because you gave people exactly what they wanted, proof that magic exists, that purity matters, and that somewhere in the world beautiful things happen to deserving people. The truth about narwhals won't reach Europe for another few centuries. By then, unicorns will be so firmly established in the popular imagination that reality won't stand a chance. And honestly, would you rather live in a world with unicorns, or a world where the most magical thing is a whale with dental problems? Part 3. When ancient bird bones became legendary eagles. Your unicorn scam was child's play compared to what's about to happen in the goldfields of ancient Scythia. You are Aristeas, a Greek gold prospector with dreams bigger than your actual mining skills. The year is 450 BCE, and you've convinced yourself that the steppes of Central Asia are hiding enough gold to make you richer than Croesus. What you haven't prepared for is sharing the landscape with the previous tenants. Your first clue that this isn't going to be a simple get-rich-quick scheme comes when your shovel hits something that definitely isn't a gold nugget. It's bone, but not from any animal you recognize. The skull that emerges from the sandy soil is the size of a cooking pot, with a wicked curved beak that could take your hand off at the wrist. Behind it, more bones reveal themselves, wings that would span the width of your tent, talons like iron spears, and hollow bones that speak of a creature built for flight. You found a protoceratops skeleton, but you don't know that. What you know is that something the size of a small horse once flew through these skies with a beak designed for serious violence. The local Scythian nomads examine your find with the grim satisfaction of people whose suspicions have just been confirmed. They've always known these lands were cursed. Their horses refuse to graze near certain valleys. Their hunting dogs whimper at shadows that shouldn't exist. Griffins, the eldest says, nodding at the bones, the guardians of the gold. You want to laugh, but the evidence is literally in your hands. The skull has the beak of an eagle and what looks like the ear holes of a great cat. The body is powerful enough to carry off a full-grown sheep. The talons could shred armor like parchment. More importantly, every gold-rich area you've surveyed seems to have these bone fields nearby, as if something was guarding the treasure and died in the process. Your mining operation takes on a decidedly different character. Your workers jump at every shadow. They whisper prayers before entering new dig sites. More than one man packs up his tools and heads home after nightfall, muttering about eyes watching from the cliffs. You press on because you're either braver or more stupid than your employees. The gold is here. You can smell it in the rock, see it glinting in the stream beds. But so are the bones, and they're everywhere. Some skeletons are complete enough to reconstruct. Others are scattered across acres, as if great battles were fought here. A few show signs of gnawing, suggesting something even larger was feeding on these creatures. The picture that emerges is of a landscape dominated by aerial predators, creatures that combine the hunting instincts of great cats with the flight capabilities of enormous birds. They nested in the mountains, hunted across the steppes, and apparently died in great numbers protecting something valuable. Your imagination fills in the gaps. These weren't just animals, they were guardians, placed here by the gods to protect the earth's treasures from greedy mortals like yourself. Their eagle eyes could spot intruders from miles away. Their lion's courage made them fearless in defense of their territory. The gold you do find comes at a cost. Every nugget feels like it's been earned through combat with invisible enemies. Every successful dig site feels like a temporary victory in a war you're destined to lose. You return to Greece with enough gold to live comfortably, but more importantly, with stories that will outlive any treasure. You tell of a land where eagle-headed lions guard vast hoards of gold, where the very sky is patrolled by creatures that make ordinary predators look like house cats. The stories grow in the telling. The griffins become larger, more intelligent, more ferocious. They develop the ability to smell gold from incredible distances. Their loyalty to their hordes becomes absolute, extending beyond death itself. Greek artists seize on these tales with enthusiasm. They paint griffins on pottery, carve them into temple facades, and weave them into tapestries for wealthy patrons who want to display their knowledge of exotic lands. The creature evolves in the artistic imagination. Sometimes it's more eagle than lion, sometimes the reverse. Occasionally it sports the tail of a serpent or the mane of a horse, but always it's associated with treasure, with guardianship, and with the kind of fierce loyalty that makes heroes weep and cowards flee. What you actually found were the fossils of creatures that lived millions of years ago when this region was a very different environment. But try explaining geological time to someone whose concept of ancient extends back maybe 3 generations. The protoceratops that inspired your griffin lived during the Cretaceous period. When these lands were lush and green, they were herbivores about the size of large dogs, with distinctive neck frills that could look remarkably like wings when preserved in certain positions. Add weathering, imagination, and the human tendency to see familiar shapes in unfamiliar objects, and suddenly you have creatures that are part bird, part mammal, and entirely mythical. But your griffin serves a purpose beyond entertainment. It explains why gold is so hard to find and so dangerous to extract. It provides a supernatural reason for the very real dangers of mining in hostile territory. It transforms the tedious, dangerous work of prospecting into a heroic quest against legendary adversaries. Your bones are long since dust, but your griffins still guard treasure in fantasy novels, video games, and the dreams of anyone who's ever wished for a more exciting explanation for life's difficulties. Part 4. When sailors fell in love with sea cows. While you were busy inventing flying lion eagles, other people were discovering that the ocean has an even stranger sense of humor. You are Christopher Hartwell, first mate aboard the merchant vessel St. Catherine, somewhere off the coast of what will eventually be called Florida. The year is 1614, and you've been at sea for 8 months without seeing anything female, except the occasional seagull. This might explain what happens next. Your ship is taking on fresh water from a coastal river when you spot something in the shallows that makes your heart skip several beats. At first glance, it's clearly a woman, long flowing hair, pale skin, and what appears to be a rather generous bosom bobbing just beneath the surface. You are, to put it mildly, interested. The woman seems equally curious about your ship. She swims closer, occasionally surfacing to breathe, her hair streaming behind her like golden seaweed. From your position on deck, she looks exactly like the mermaids described in the stories your grandmother used to tell. You grab the ship's telescope for a better look, because you're a thorough man who believes in gathering all available evidence before jumping to conclusions about supernatural sea women. This turns out to be a mistake. Through the magnified lens, several uncomfortable facts become apparent. The flowing hair is actually algae and seaweed. The pale skin has a distinctly greyish, rubbery quality. The generous bosom is attached to a creature roughly the size and shape of a floating wine barrel with flippers. You have just fallen in love with a manatee. The creature seems blissfully unaware of your existential crisis. It continues to surface and dive, occasionally rolling over to scratch its back on the river bottom, displaying a grace that's impressive for something that looks like it was designed by a committee of people who'd never seen a proper mammal. Your fellow sailors crowd the rail, eager to see the mermaid you've been shouting about. Their enthusiasm dims considerably when they get a proper look at your aquatic beauty. "That's not a mermaid, Chris," says Tom Weatherby, the ship's cook, with the patience of a man explaining arithmetic to a particularly slow child. "That's the ugliest bloody sea pig I've ever laid eyes on." But you're not ready to abandon your mermaid theory. After 8 months at sea, you've invested considerable emotional energy in the possibility of romantic encounters with fish women. The alternative, that you've been harboring inappropriate feelings for marine livestock, is too depressing to contemplate. From a distance, you argue in poor light with a bit of imagination, she's got a certain something. This becomes the foundation of mermaid lore for the next 4 centuries. Sailors see what they want to see, especially when what they want to see involves women, and they haven't talked to an actual woman since last port. The manatee, for its part, is just trying to eat lunch. These gentle giants spend most of their time grazing on seagrass, surfacing to breathe every few minutes, and generally living lives of aquatic contentment that would make philosophers weep with envy. But sailors don't want to hear about seagrass and breathing patterns. They want romance, mystery, and the possibility that somewhere in the vast ocean, beautiful women are waiting to be rescued from their curse of eternal swimming. The stories improve with each telling. The manatees become more human-like. Their peaceful grazing becomes enchanting singing. Their habit of following warm currents becomes evidence of their magical nature. By the time these tales reach European ports, the creatures have been transformed into sirens capable of luring ships to their doom with supernatural beauty and otherworldly voices. Never mind that the average manatee has about as much supernatural power as a floating cabbage and roughly the same vocal range. But humans have always been excellent at collaborative storytelling, especially when the alternative is admitting that their ancestors fell in love with sea cows. The transformation accelerates in the artistic imagination. Ancient Greek sirens were originally bird women, creatures of air and song who perched on rocky cliffs. But maritime cultures need their monsters to come from the sea, so the sirens grow fishtails and move underwater. Artists who've never seen a manatee or any large marine mammal rely on descriptions from sailors who've spent too long at sea and have questionable judgment about marine biology. The results are predictably romantic and completely divorced from reality. Meanwhile, actual manatees continue their lives of magnificent tedium. They're herbivores who can weigh up to 1,200 pounds, move at the breakneck speed of about 5 miles per hour, and have all the predatory instincts of a floating mattress. They're also remarkably intelligent, curious about humans, and capable of forming what scientists now recognize as genuine emotional bonds with their caretakers. In other words, they actually are better companions than most sailors deserve, just not in the way anyone expected. Your ship sails on, leaving the manatees to their seagrass and their simple pleasures. But the damage is done. You've contributed to a mythology that will persist long after anyone remembers your name or the St. Catherine's Cargo Manifest. Centuries later, marine biologists will study these same creatures and marvel at their gentle nature, their complex social structures, and their tragic vulnerability to human activity. They'll note that manatees are more closely related to elephants than to any marine mammal, a connection that explains their intelligence and their unfortunate tendency to trust species that don't always deserve it. But by then, the mermaids have taken on a life of their own. They've inspired operas, novels, and more movies than any self-respecting sea cow should have to endure. They represent everything humans want from the ocean: beauty, mystery, and the promise that somewhere out there, someone is waiting to love us despite our obvious flaws. Not bad for a creature whose greatest ambition is finding the perfect patch of seagrass and taking a really good nap. Part 5. When giant squids decided to ruin everyone's day. Your romantic disappointment with sea cows is nothing compared to what's lurking in the deeper waters, waiting to turn perfectly reasonable fishing trips into nightmares that spawn centuries of maritime terror. You are Olaf Bjornsson, captain of the fishing vessel Seawolf, operating out of Bergen, Norway, in the year 1752. You've been fishing these waters since you were old enough to tell one end of a boat from the other, and you thought you'd seen everything the North Atlantic had to offer. You were spectacularly wrong. The morning starts like any other. Your crew of 8 hardy souls rows out before dawn, nets ready, prayers said, hoping for enough cod to make the voyage profitable. The sea is unusually calm, mirror smooth in a way that should have been your first warning. Experienced fishermen know that the ocean doesn't do peaceful without reason. Your nets are down about 2 hours when young Henrik starts shouting from the bow. He's pointing at something in the water, his voice climbing toward the range typically reserved for encountering supernatural phenomena or tax collectors. You follow his gaze and immediately understand his distress. The water around your boat is moving in ways that water shouldn't move. It's swirling, churning, and developing what can only be described as intentionality. Then you see the tentacle. It breaks the surface about 50 yards away, thick as a tree trunk and longer than your entire boat. It rises up, water streaming from what appear to be suckers the size of dinner plates, and for a moment it seems to be examining you with the same curiosity you're showing it. The moment passes quickly. More tentacles emerge, 8 of them in total, each one large enough to wrap around your mast and squeeze until something important breaks. Behind them comes a head that belongs in your worst nightmares, a mass of muscle and malevolence with eyes the size of cartwheels and a beak that could bite through your hull like parchment. You are face to face with a giant squid, and it appears to be having opinions about your presence in its neighborhood. Your crew responds with the calm professionalism that Norwegian fishermen are famous for, which is to say they start screaming and running in circles around a boat that's far too small for effective panic. The creature rises further from the water, revealing a body that dwarfs your vessel, 30 feet of muscled predator that looks like it was designed by someone with strong opinions about making sure humans remember their place in the food chain. But here's where things get interesting. Instead of immediately crushing your boat like a walnut, the squid seems curious. It extends one tentacle toward your hull, feeling along the wood with delicate precision. The suckers explore your boat's construction with what almost seems like scientific interest. This is not the behavior you expected from a sea monster. This is the behavior of an intelligent creature trying to figure out what the hell you are. Your terror begins to mix with fascination. The tentacles move with coordination that speaks of a sophisticated nervous system. The eyes track your movements with obvious intelligence. When you wave your hat, the creature actually tilts its massive head, as if considering this strange ritual. The encounter lasts perhaps 10 minutes, but it feels like hours. Finally, the squid seems to reach a conclusion about your significance, namely that you're too small to eat, too strange to understand, and probably not worth the effort of destruction. It sinks back into the depths with the casual indifference of a creature that has better things to do than terrorize Norwegian fishermen. Your crew spends the row back to shore in uncharacteristic silence. What do you say after witnessing something that challenges everything you thought you knew about the natural world? By the time you reach port, however, the story has begun its inevitable transformation. The squid was bigger, 50 feet long. It grabbed the boat and tried to drag it underwater. You fought it off with harpoons and prayers, barely escaping with your lives. Each telling adds new details. The creature had the intelligence of a demon and the malevolence of tax policy. It spoke in voices like grinding millstones. It commanded lesser sea monsters to do its bidding. Within a month, your encounter has become the stuff of legend. The Kraken has awakened, and it's not happy about the increasing number of ships using its territory as a highway. Other captains begin reporting similar encounters, ships found with massive sucker marks on their hulls, crews who speak of tentacles as thick as church pillars and eyes that burn with otherworldly intelligence. The truth is both simpler and more amazing than the stories suggest. Giant squids are real. They can grow to enormous sizes, and they're among the most intelligent invertebrates on Earth. They live in the deep ocean, rarely coming to the surface except when dying or disoriented. But when they do surface, the encounter is so far outside normal human experience that witness accounts inevitably drift toward the supernatural. How else do you explain a creature that seems to have stepped out of humanity's collective nightmares? The Kraken becomes Norway's greatest contribution to maritime mythology. It's said to be large enough to be mistaken for an island, capable of creating whirlpools that can sink entire fleets, and possessed of intelligence that rivals human cunning. Maps begin marking areas of the North Atlantic as here be dragons, or more specifically, here the Kraken waits. Sailors develop elaborate rituals for appeasing the beast, ranging from offerings of alcohol to promises of good behavior. The creature grows in the cultural imagination. Sometimes it's a squid, sometimes an octopus. occasionally a hybrid of both with extra features added for dramatic effect. It gains the ability to control weather, command other sea creatures, and hold grudges that span generations. Meanwhile, real giant squids continue living their mysterious lives in the deep ocean, occasionally surfacing to confuse fishermen and inspire centuries of maritime terror. They're impressive enough on their own, intelligent, enormous, and perfectly adapted to an environment humans can barely comprehend. But apparently, reality isn't quite terrifying enough for the human imagination. We need our sea monsters to be supernatural, not just spectacular. We need them to have malicious intent, not just the bad timing to encounter our boats when they're already having the worst day of their lives. Your encounter with that curious, intelligent creature becomes the foundation for countless stories of oceanic horror. And honestly, given how little we still know about what lives in the deep ocean, maybe that's not entirely unreasonable. Part 6. When birds decided to fake their own deaths. While you were busy creating maritime nightmares in the North Atlantic, ancient Egypt was dealing with birds that had developed a flair for the theatrical. You are Keti, royal scribe to Pharaoh Amenhotep III, and you have the prestigious job of recording everything weird that happens in the kingdom. Given that this is ancient Egypt, where cats are gods and pyramids are weekend projects, weird covers a lot of territory. Today's weirdness involves a bird that apparently doesn't understand the basic concept of staying dead. The sacred lake of Heliopolis is where you've come to investigate reports of divine manifestations. The priests claim that the Bennu bird, herald of the sun god Ra, has been appearing at dawn for 7 consecutive days, dying in flames, and returning to life as the sun rises. You're skeptical, but you're also getting paid to be here, so you set up your writing materials and wait for whatever's about to happen. The sun hasn't quite crested the horizon when you hear it, a sound like wind through reeds, but with an underlying harmony that makes your spine tingle. Something large is moving through the morning mist, and it's coming toward the lake. What emerges from the dawn light is the most spectacular bird you've ever seen, taller than a grown man, with plumage that shifts between gold and crimson as it moves. Its neck is long and graceful, its legs are impossibly thin, and its entire body seems to glow with its own internal fire. The bird wades into the shallow water, extends its wings, and begins what can only be described as a performance. It dances, if you can call the careful, ritualized movements of a creature following instincts older than human civilization, a dance. Then, just as the sun breaks the horizon, something remarkable happens. The bird's plumage catches the light and seems to burst into flames. For a moment it's surrounded by what looks like fire, wings spread in a gesture of triumph or defiance, and then it collapses. You rush to the water's edge, certain you're about to record the death of a divine creature, but the corpse is breathing, and after a few minutes it stands up, shakes the water from its feathers, and walks away with the dignity of a creature that knows it's just delivered a performance worthy of the gods. What you've witnessed is a flamingo's morning ritual, but you don't know that. Flamingos are filter feeders that live in highly alkaline lakes, and their behavior is adapted to some of the harshest conditions on Earth. When they're feeding, they spend long periods with their heads underwater, occasionally surfacing in ways that can look like death and resurrection to imaginative observers. More importantly, their plumage contains carotenoids, the same compounds that make carrots orange, which create spectacular color displays when caught in the right light. At sunrise, with the proper angle and a bit of morning mist, a flamingo can look like it's literally on fire. Add the natural human tendency to see patterns and meaning in unusual events, plus the Egyptian love of elaborate religious symbolism, and you have the birth of the phoenix. Your report to the pharaoh is carefully worded but enthusiastic. You describe a bird that embodies the daily rebirth of the sun, dying each evening and returning to life each dawn. It's a perfect metaphor for the cyclical nature of existence, the triumph of life over death, and the eternal renewal that keeps the world turning. The pharaoh is delighted. This is exactly the sort of divine endorsement a ruler needs, proof that the gods are actively involved in maintaining cosmic order. He orders artists to create images of the Bennu bird for temples and tombs, ensuring that this symbol of resurrection will accompany the faithful into the afterlife. The story spreads beyond Egypt, carried by traders and diplomats, who understand a good tale when they hear one. But like all good stories, it improves with distance from the original source. By the time the phoenix reaches Greek mythology, it's no longer a daily occurrence but a once-in-a-lifetime event. The bird now lives for 500 years before building a nest of aromatic wood and spices, setting itself on fire, and emerging reborn from the ashes. This is considerably more dramatic than the original flamingo feeding schedule, but it's also more useful as a metaphor. Humans need their symbols to match the scale of their problems, and daily resurrection is almost too easy. Real transformation, the kind that matters, should require sacrifice, time, and the willingness to burn away everything you used to be. The Greeks add their own touches to the myth. The phoenix becomes unique net. There's only one in the world at any given time. Its song can heal the sick and inspire the dying. Its tears have magical properties. Its feathers can grant immortality to mortals worthy of such gifts. Roman writers embrace the phoenix as a symbol of imperial renewal. Each new emperor represents a phoenix rising from the ashes of the old regime, bringing fresh hope to a weary world. Never mind that most imperial transitions involved considerably more stabbing and considerably less graceful symbolism than the metaphor suggested. Christian writers adopt the phoenix as proof of resurrection, divine renewal, and the promise of life after death. A bird that can overcome death through fire becomes the perfect symbol for faith that survives persecution and emerges stronger than before. But your flamingo doesn't care about any of this. It's just trying to make a living in one of the most challenging environments on Earth, filtering algae and small crustaceans from water that would kill most creatures. Its spectacular plumage is a side effect of its diet, not a divine statement about cosmic renewal. The alkaline lakes where flamingos live are scattered across the world from East Africa to South America to the Mediterranean. They're places where life exists on the edge, where only specially adapted creatures can survive the extreme conditions. These birds have evolved remarkable strategies for thriving in environments that seem designed to kill everything else. They can drink boiling water, process salt concentrations that would dehydrate other animals, and extract nutrition from sources that other birds can't even digest. In other words, they actually are miraculous creatures, just not in the way anyone expected. They've achieved a kind of biological immortality through adaptation, renewal through evolution, and rebirth through the simple persistence of life in impossible places. Your careful observations become the foundation for one of humanity's most enduring symbols. The phoenix appears in literature, art, and popular culture as the ultimate expression of hope, the promise that no matter how complete the destruction, something better can emerge from the ashes. Cities adopt the phoenix as their symbol after devastating fires. People invoke it during personal crises, using the imagery of death and rebirth to frame their own struggles with loss, change, and recovery. It becomes shorthand for resilience, transformation, and the human capacity to begin again. Meanwhile, flamingos continue their ancient dance at alkaline lakes around the world, occasionally catching the light in ways that make observers wonder if they're witnessing something supernatural. They remain one of nature's most spectacular examples of beauty emerging from harsh circumstances, life thriving where it shouldn't be possible. But they're also a reminder that sometimes the most powerful myths begin with careful observation of the natural world. Your flamingo really was performing a daily miracle, the miracle of survival, adaptation, and the persistent beauty that emerges when life refuses to give up. Not bad for a bird that's essentially a living water filter with exceptionally good taste in sunrises. Part 7. When snakes learned to kill with their eyes. Your phoenix was impressive, but ancient civilizations were just getting started with turning perfectly reasonable animals into supernatural nightmares. You are Marcus Flavius, a Roman naturalist with more curiosity than common sense, currently sweating your way through the deserts of North Africa in the year 127 CE. You're here because Emperor Hadrian has developed an interest in exotic creatures, and you've been tasked with bringing back specimens and stories that will impress the imperial court. What you're about to discover will give children nightmares for the next 2,000 years. Your local guide, a Berber tribesman named Kahina, has been trying to convince you to turn back for the past 3 days. He keeps pointing at tracks in the sand and muttering warnings about the king of serpents that lives in these ruins. You dismiss his concerns with the confidence of a man who's read every natural history scroll in Rome and believes that education trumps local superstition. This attitude is about to be tested in ways you haven't anticipated. The ruins you're exploring are the remains of an ancient settlement, abandoned so long ago that even the locals have forgotten its name. But the stone foundations still provide shelter for various desert creatures, and you're hoping to find something unusual enough to justify this miserable journey. You find it. The snake that emerges from beneath a fallen column is unlike anything in your scrolls. It's about 6 feet long, thick as a man's arm, and covered in scales that seem to shift color in the desert light. But what captures your attention and freezes your blood are its eyes. They're enormous, taking up a disproportionate amount of the creature's head, and they seem to glow with their own internal light. When the snake looks at you, really looks at you, you feel something fundamental shift in your nervous system. Your vision blurs, your legs feel unsteady, your heart starts beating in rhythms that don't seem entirely under your control. The snake doesn't move toward you. It doesn't need to. It simply holds your gaze, and you find yourself unable to look away. There's something hypnotic about those eyes, something that seems to reach directly into your brain and start rearranging the furniture. You try to step backward and discover that your body isn't taking orders from your brain anymore. Your muscles have turned to water. Your thoughts feel sluggish, as if someone's filled your head with honey. The snake tilts its head, studying you with what appears to be scientific interest. You have the uncomfortable feeling that you're being evaluated as a potential meal. This is when Kahina saves your life by throwing a rock at the creature's head. The snake, apparently deciding that lunch isn't worth dealing with aggressive locals, slithers away with offended dignity. Your guide helps you to a shaded area and waits for your nervous system to remember how to function properly. When you can finally speak again, your first question is obvious. What in Jupiter's name was that thing? Basilisk, Kahina replies matter-of-factly. King of serpents, kills with its gaze. Lucky for you, this one wasn't hungry. You want to argue, but the evidence is difficult to dismiss. Something about that creature's stare had rendered you helpless. Whether it was supernatural power or some natural mechanism you don't understand, the effect was undeniably real. What you've encountered is probably a sand boa or monitor lizard, creatures that have evolved some remarkable survival strategies for desert life. But you're not a herpetologist, and the heat, stress, and genuine fear of the encounter have colored your perception in ways that science won't sort out for centuries. The large eyes that so disturbed you serve a practical purpose. Many desert creatures have evolved enhanced vision for hunting in low-light conditions. The apparent color shifting of the scales is a common adaptation for camouflage in varied terrain. As for the hypnotic effect, several factors could explain your experience. Heat exhaustion, dehydration, and simple fear can all produce symptoms that feel like supernatural intervention. Add the power of suggestion from Kahina's warnings, and you have all the ingredients for a genuinely terrifying encounter with a perfectly normal reptile. But perfectly normal reptile doesn't make for impressive dinner conversation back in Rome. Your report to Emperor Hadrian describes a creature of supernatural malevolence, capable of killing with a glance and commanding lesser serpents through force of will alone. You detail its immunity to conventional weapons, its ability to petrify victims with terror, and its role as guardian of ancient treasures. The Emperor is fascinated. This is exactly the sort of exotic wonder that demonstrates the vast reach of Roman power and knowledge. He orders artists to create mosaics depicting the basilisk, writers to compose verses about its terrible power, and philosophers to debate its place in the natural order. The story spreads throughout the empire with the efficiency of good gossip and the embellishments of bad telephone. Each telling adds new details about the creature's supernatural abilities. Medieval bestiaries embrace the basilisk with enthusiasm. It becomes the king of serpents, born from a serpent's egg, incubated by a cockerel and hatched during the dog days of summer. Its gaze can kill instantly, its breath can poison the air for miles, and its very presence can crack stones and wither plants. The creature acquires weaknesses that balance its terrible power. It dies if it sees its own reflection, can be killed by the crow of a rooster, and flees from weasels with inexplicable terror. These limitations make it suitable for heroic stories where clever protagonists can defeat supernatural threats through wit rather than force. Christian writers adopt the basilisk as a symbol of evil, sin, and the corrupting power of Satan. It becomes the serpent of Eden with extra features, representing everything dangerous about temptation and forbidden knowledge. But your original encounter was probably with a creature that was just trying to digest its last meal in peace. Desert reptiles are ambush predators that rely on patience, camouflage, and the element of surprise. When confronted by large, noisy humans, their first instinct is usually to avoid confrontation rather than engage in supernatural combat. The deadly gaze you experienced was most likely the result of an animal assessing whether you represented a threat or potential food. Many predators have evolved the ability to freeze prey with direct eye contact, not through supernatural power, but through the simple psychological effect of being stared at by something that might eat you. Your basilisk lives on in fantasy literature, video games, and the occasional appearance in natural history museums, where actual monitor lizards disappoint visitors who expected something more obviously supernatural. But it serves an important function in human culture. It represents the fear of being observed, judged, and found wanting by forces beyond our control. In a world where survival often depends on not being noticed by dangerous predators, the basilisk embodies our ancestral terror of being seen by something that wishes us harm. Not bad for a lizard that just wanted to take a nap in the shade. Part 8. When ancient Greeks discovered elephants had poor interior decorating skills, your terrifying encounter with a possibly supernatural lizard was nothing compared to what ancient Greeks were about to conclude from some very misleading home decor choices made by long-dead elephants. You are Alexios of Knossos, a pottery merchant with a side interest in natural philosophy and a complete lack of training in what will someday be called paleontology. The year is 401 BCE, and you've just discovered something in a cave on Crete that's going to fundamentally challenge your understanding of the natural world. What you found is a skull the size of a wine amphora, with what appears to be a single enormous eye socket right in the center of its forehead. You're holding the remains of a creature that looks like it stepped out of the oldest, most terrifying stories your grandmother used to tell. A giant with one eye, powerful enough to hurl boulders and stupid enough to be tricked by clever heroes with questionable moral standards. The skull is massive, larger than anything you've seen from a known animal. The bone is thick enough to withstand tremendous impacts, but it's that central cavity that captures your imagination. A perfectly round hole that could have housed an eye the size of a man's fist. Your mind immediately jumps to the stories of Cyclopes, the one-eyed giants who forged thunderbolts for Zeus and built the great walls of ancient cities. These weren't just stories, apparently. They were historical records of creatures that actually walked the earth. What you don't know is that you're looking at the skull of a dwarf elephant, specifically one of the species that lived on Mediterranean islands until relatively recently, in geological terms. The eye socket is actually the nasal cavity, where the trunk was attached. Elephant skulls have this unfortunate characteristic when the soft tissue decomposes. The trunk attachment point looks remarkably like a giant eye socket positioned exactly where a cyclops eye should be. The actual eye sockets are smaller, positioned on the sides of the skull, and easily overlooked by someone who's already convinced they've found evidence of mythological creatures. But you're not thinking about trunks or alternative anatomical arrangements. You're thinking about the implications of your discovery. If cyclopes were real, What else from the old stories might be walking around out there? You carefully excavate more of the skeleton, finding leg bones that suggest a creature of enormous size and strength. The hip bones are massive, designed to support tremendous weight. The rib cage could have sheltered a grown man. Everything about this skeleton suggests a creature perfectly adapted for the kind of heavy labor described in the myths. Building walls from massive stones, carrying enormous burdens, working in the forges of the gods where mere humans would be crushed by the scale of the enterprise. Your discovery becomes the talk of Knossos, then Crete, then the broader Greek world. Scholars arrive to examine your find, and they reach the same conclusion you did. This is proof that the age of heroes and monsters wasn't just poetry, it was history. The implications are staggering. If giants once walked the earth, if creatures of supernatural power were real, then the stories of gods interacting with mortals take on a very different character. Maybe the old tales weren't allegories or entertainment. Maybe they were eyewitness accounts of a time when the world was very different from what it is today. Your Cyclops skull becomes evidence for a golden age when magic was real, when gods walked among mortals, and when the natural world operated according to rules that modern philosophers can barely imagine. Artists begin depicting Cyclopes based on your discovery. They're shown as massive humanoids with single eyes, incredible strength, and the kind of straightforward approach to problem solving that involves throwing large rocks at things they don't like. The creatures become symbols of primal power, ancient wisdom, and the dangerous consequences of disturbing forces that modern humans have forgotten how to understand. They represent a time when the Earth was younger, wilder, and populated by beings that made ordinary mortals look like children playing with toy swords. But your elephant had lived a much more peaceful existence than the myths suggest. Dwarf elephants were herbivores that had evolved on isolated islands where there were no large predators. They were actually smaller than their mainland cousins, adapted to environments where resources were limited, and the ability to swim between islands was more important than intimidating potential threats. These creatures had lived quiet lives, browsing on island vegetation, raising their young in small herds, and occasionally dealing with the challenges of finding fresh water during dry seasons. Their biggest daily concern was probably locating enough food to maintain their body weight, not forging weapons for temperamental gods. The giant proportions that so impressed you were actually the result of island gigantism and dwarfism, evolutionary processes that create unusual body sizes in isolated populations. Some species grow larger on islands, others grow smaller depending on the ecological pressures they face. Your Cyclops had been part of a population that had survived on Crete for thousands of years before finally dying out, probably due to climate change, human activity, or simple bad luck. They left behind only their bones and the occasional confused archaeologist who couldn't figure out why elephants had such weird skull architecture. But the myth serves a purpose beyond entertaining children and inspiring pottery designs. The Cyclops represents humanity's relationship with forces we can't control or fully understand. They're skilled craftsmen but dangerous neighbors, powerful allies, but unpredictable enemies. They embody the double-edged nature of technology, strength and knowledge, capable of creating wonders or destroying everything we care about, depending on who's controlling them and what kind of mood they're in. Your elephant skull becomes the foundation for stories that will persist for millennia, inspiring everything from epic poetry to cartoon shows. The Cyclops evolves from a genuine attempt to understand confusing physical evidence into a symbol of primal power, ancient wisdom, and the consequences of underestimating forces that seem simple on the surface. Not bad for a creature whose most impressive skill was probably finding the ripest fruit on trees that were just slightly too tall for comfort. Part 9. When medieval doctors created monsters from medical ignorance. Your ancient Greeks had it easy, dealing with elephants that had been polite enough to die before causing any real confusion. Medieval Europe was about to prove that living humans could be far more terrifying than any fossil. Your brother Thomas of Whitby, a monk with basic medical training and absolutely no understanding of infectious diseases, mental illness, or genetic conditions, The year is 1347, and you're about to encounter a series of medical phenomena that will convince you that the devil has started recruiting locally. Your monastery serves as both spiritual center and medical facility for the surrounding villages, which means you see everything the human body can do wrong when it doesn't have access to proper healthcare, nutrition, or basic sanitation. Today's challenge walks through your door just after morning prayers. The man who enters your infirmary was once a prosperous farmer named William de Clare. You know this because his wife is with him, weeping and crossing herself repeatedly while explaining that her husband has been taken by the wolf curse. What you see supports her supernatural interpretation of events. William's face is covered with thick, coarse hair that grows in patches across his cheeks and forehead. His teeth appear longer and sharper than they should be. His eyes have taken on a wild, unfocused quality that suggests his mind is no longer entirely his own. Most disturbing of all, he moves with a strange, lurching gait, as if his bones have been rearranged by forces that don't understand human anatomy. When he tries to speak, only growls and whimpers emerge. You are looking at a textbook case of rabies, complicated by what will someday be diagnosed as hypertrichosis, a genetic condition that causes excessive hair growth. But you don't know about viruses, genetics, or the fact that rabies is transmitted through animal bites. What you know is that werewolves are real, they're standing in your infirmary, and church doctrine is remarkably unclear about the appropriate treatment protocol for lycanthropy. William's condition has been developing for weeks. It started with a bite from a dog that seemed healthy at the time. The wound healed normally, but then he began experiencing strange symptoms: sensitivity to light and sound, difficulty swallowing, periods of agitation followed by episodes of paralysis. His family interpreted these changes through the lens of available folklore. The bite had occurred during a full moon. William had always been somewhat hairy, though his condition has recently become more pronounced. He'd been acting increasingly aggressive, especially toward livestock. By medieval standards, this is an open and shut case of demonic transformation. You examine William with the thoroughness that your training allows, which is to say you check his pulse, examine his urine, and pray for divine guidance. The medical texts you've studied mention lycanthropy as a form of melancholia complicated by supernatural influence. The recommended treatment involves a combination of prayer, fasting, bloodletting, and the application of various herbs that are supposed to counteract demonic possession. You're not optimistic about the chances of success, but you're obligated to try. What follows is a week of increasingly desperate medical intervention. William's condition deteriorates rapidly. The periods of lucidity become shorter and less frequent. The physical symptoms intensify. His fear of water becomes so severe that the mere sight of your wash basin sends him into convulsions. His wife maintains a vigil that combines grief, terror, and the kind of stubborn faith that refuses to accept supernatural explanations for natural phenomena. She insists that her husband is still in there somewhere, trapped inside a body that no longer obeys his will. She's more right than she knows. Rabies attacks the nervous system in ways that preserve consciousness while destroying motor control. William is aware of what's happening to him, but he's powerless to stop the virus from systematically dismantling his ability to function as a human being. You record his symptoms with the careful attention to detail that medieval medicine demands: the excessive hair growth, the altered behavior, the aversion to water, the inability to speak coherently. Every observation supports the lycanthropy diagnosis. What you're actually documenting is the progression of a viral infection complicated by a genetic condition that medieval Europe had no framework for understanding. But your careful notes will become source material for werewolf lore for centuries to come. William dies on the 7th day, during a seizure that leaves his body twisted in ways that suggest tremendous suffering. His final moments are mercifully brief, but they're witnessed by half the village, who interpret his death throes as evidence of the soul's struggle to escape demonic possession. Word of the werewolf spreads with the efficiency of genuinely terrifying news. Other villagers report similar cases. The symptoms vary, but the pattern is consistent: animal attacks, followed by progressive transformation into something that's no longer entirely human. What's actually happening is a rabies outbreak, complicated by medieval Europe's complete inability to understand infectious disease. The virus spreads through animal bites, particularly from dogs and wolves that have been infected by contact with rabid bats or other wildlife. But rabies symptoms align disturbingly well with folkloric descriptions of lycanthropy. The hydrophobia, the aggression, the periods of apparent madness alternating with moments of clarity. Add the occasional victim with hypertrichosis, and you have all the components necessary for a supernatural epidemic. The medical community responds with the tools available to medieval science: bloodletting, prayer, and increasingly exotic herbal remedies that do nothing to address the underlying viral infection. The failure of these treatments only reinforces the supernatural interpretation of the disease. Werewolf lore evolves to incorporate these medical observations. The creatures become associated with rabies, symptoms fear of water, aversion to light, uncontrollable aggression. The transformation is no longer just physical but psychological, representing the loss of human identity to animal instincts. The stories serve a practical purpose beyond entertainment. They provide a framework for understanding and responding to a disease that medieval medicine couldn't treat or prevent. Werewolf lore becomes a form of public health education, teaching people to avoid contact with potentially infected animals and to recognize the early symptoms of rabies exposure. Your careful documentation of William's case becomes part of a medical tradition that will persist until the development of modern virology. Medieval physicians record hundreds of similar cases, each one adding details to the growing body of werewolf lore. But the real tragedy isn't the supernatural interpretation of natural phenomena. It's the human cost of medical ignorance in an age when a simple animal bite could transform a prosperous farmer into a cautionary tale that terrifies children for generations. William de Clare deserved better than becoming a monster in other people's stories, but he lived in an age when the best medical minds in Europe were still centuries away from understanding the invisible world of viruses, bacteria, and genetic variations that shape human health. His legacy lives on in every werewolf story ever told, a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones created by our inability to understand the perfectly natural horrors that surround us every day. Part 10. When death wasn't quite as permanent as expected. Your werewolf epidemic was terrifying enough, but medieval Europe was about to discover that death itself wasn't as reliable as people had assumed. You are Father Matthias Corvinus, parish priest of the village of Brazov in Wallachia, and you've just received a complaint that would test the faith of a saint. It's 1456, and your parishioners are insisting that Vlad Dracul has been seen walking around the cemetery at midnight, despite being definitively dead for the past 3 months. This is the sort of pastoral problem they didn't cover in seminary. The reports are disturbingly consistent. Multiple witnesses describe a pale figure moving among the graves, apparently searching for something or someone. The figure matches Vlad's height and build, wears clothing similar to what he was buried in, and shows the same imperious bearing that made him such a charming dinner companion when he was alive. More troubling, several villagers have reported waking up feeling weak and dizzy, with small wounds on their necks that they don't remember receiving. 2 children have died of what appears to be a wasting disease, growing pale and listless before simply failing to wake up one morning. Your medical knowledge is limited, but you recognize the symptoms of what the old women call the thirsting sickness, a condition that seems to spread from person to person, leaving victims drained of vitality and life. What you're actually dealing with is an outbreak of tuberculosis, complicated by premature burial, medieval Europe's shocking ignorance about decomposition, and the human tendency to see patterns in coincidental events. But try explaining that to peasants who've been telling vampire stories since before Christianity reached these mountains. The tuberculosis epidemic explains most of the mysterious deaths. The disease causes the pale, wasted appearance that people associate with vampiric feeding. The characteristic cough produces blood, which medieval medicine interprets as evidence of internal bleeding caused by supernatural predation. More importantly, tuberculosis is highly contagious, especially in the cramped, poorly ventilated conditions where most people live. When one family member dies of the disease, others often follow, creating the impression of a supernatural creature systematically draining life from its victims. But the real catalyst for your vampire crisis is Vlad himself, or rather, what happened to him after his supposedly final death. Medieval Europe has a serious problem with premature burial. Medical knowledge is so limited that distinguishing between death and unconsciousness often amounts to guesswork. People who appear dead are buried quickly, especially during disease outbreaks when everyone is terrified of contagion. Some of these corpses wake up. Vlad Dracul was buried in a shallow grave during the height of summer, and the ground was too hard for proper excavation. 3 days later, grave robbers trying to steal his burial goods discovered that the coffin was empty and the earth around the grave had been disturbed from the inside. The most reasonable explanation is that Vlad wasn't quite as dead as everyone assumed. He woke up, clawed his way out of his grave, and wandered off into the night, probably confused, injured, and understandably upset about the whole experience. But this reasonable explanation doesn't account for the sightings that continue for months afterward. What people are probably seeing is a combination of grieving family members visiting the grave, local wildlife moving through the cemetery, and the effects of guilt, fear, and suggestion on people who already believe in vampires. Medieval cemeteries are not the peaceful, well-maintained spaces that modern people imagine. They're often overcrowded, poorly drained areas where bodies are buried in shallow graves that are easily disturbed by scavengers. The smell of decomposition attracts various animals, and the sight of disturbed graves reinforces beliefs about the restless dead. Add the tuberculosis outbreak, the mysterious empty grave, and the power of suggestion, and you have all the ingredients necessary for a vampire epidemic. Your response follows established church protocol for dealing with the undead. You organize a group of villagers to excavate suspected vampire graves, looking for signs of supernatural preservation or unnatural behavior. What you find is exactly what church doctrine predicts: bodies that haven't decomposed as expected, corpses with blood around their mouths, and remains that appear to have moved within their coffins. These observations have perfectly natural explanations. Decomposition rates vary dramatically depending on soil conditions, burial depth, and seasonal temperature. Bodies buried in clay soil or during cold weather can remain remarkably well preserved for months. The blood around the mouth is a normal result of decomposition, as organs break down, fluids accumulate, and are expelled through natural openings. The appearance of movement in the coffin is usually caused by the expansion of gases during decomposition, which can shift the body's position. But you're not a forensic scientist. You're a medieval priest dealing with what appears to be supernatural evidence of demonic activity. Your solution follows traditional vampire hunting methodology: stakes through the heart, decapitation, and reburial in consecrated ground with appropriate prayers and protective symbols. The ritual is gruesome but necessary to prevent the spread of undead influence. The epidemic ends shortly after your intervention, which everyone takes as proof of its effectiveness. The tuberculosis outbreak runs its natural course. The premature burial problem is temporarily solved by more careful examination of the deceased, and the power of suggestion is broken by decisive supernatural countermeasures. Your vampire crisis becomes the template for hundreds of similar outbreaks across Eastern Europe. The symptoms, the investigative procedures, and the solutions become standardized, creating a body of folklore that persists into the modern era. But the real tragedy isn't the supernatural interpretation of natural phenomena. It's the human cost of medical ignorance in an age when a simple respiratory infection could kill entire families, and when the fear of death was so overwhelming that people preferred to believe in monsters rather than accept the randomness of disease. The vampire serves a psychological function beyond explaining mysterious deaths. It provides a supernatural enemy that can be fought, defeated, and prevented through proper ritual observance. In a world where death often seems arbitrary and unstoppable, vampires offer the comfort of believing that some deaths at least can be reversed or prevented. Vlad Dracula's empty grave becomes the foundation for vampire lore that will inspire centuries of literature, films, and cultural anxiety about the boundary between life and death. His brief career as a potentially undead menace evolves into stories of aristocratic immortals with romantic problems and dietary restrictions. But the original vampire was just a man who may have been buried before he was quite finished living, in a time when the difference between life and death was often a matter of opinion rather than medical certainty. Your careful documentation of the outbreak, complete with witness testimonies and ritual countermeasures, becomes source material for vampire hunters who don't realize they're following protocols designed to address tuberculosis outbreaks and premature burial. But maybe that's not entirely wrong. In a world where disease and death were poorly understood, vampires provided a framework for recognizing, responding to, and surviving phenomena that medieval medicine couldn't explain or treat. Sometimes the monsters we create to explain our fears are more useful than the truth we're not ready to understand. Part 11. When ancient trade routes created designer monsters. Your vampire epidemic was contained, but ancient civilizations were just hitting their stride in the monster creation business, and they were about to prove that collaborative storytelling could produce creatures that made individual nightmares look like bedtime stories. You are Darius the Merchant, a Persian trader whose caravan routes stretch from the markets of Babylon to the ports of the Black Sea. The year is 520 BCE, and you've built your fortune on understanding that the most profitable cargo isn't silk or spices, it's stories that people will pay to hear. Your latest acquisition is going to make you rich beyond your wildest dreams, assuming it doesn't give your customers permanent nightmares first. The creature's head sits in a specially constructed cage in your lead wagon, preserved in honey and aromatic herbs that do nothing to diminish its unsettling presence. It's the head of what your Lydian contact swore was a chimera beast with the head of a lion, the body of a goat, and the tail of a serpent. What you actually have is a lion's head that's been artfully modified by someone with considerable skill in taxidermy and a disturbing imagination. But your customers don't need to know about the craftsmanship that went into creating this particular marvel. The story you've been told and the one you're selling is that this creature terrorized the mountains near Lycia until a hero named Bellerophon killed it with the help of a flying horse. The beast could breathe fire, had the strength of 10 lions, and the cunning of a serpent that had been studying human weaknesses for centuries. Your Persian customers are fascinated by the concept. They've heard rumors of such creatures from their own mountain regions, though the local versions tend to have different combinations of animal parts and supernatural abilities. The Babylonians add their own touches to the story. Their chimeras have the wings of eagles and the ability to speak in the voices of their victims. The creature becomes a symbol of chaos, representing the kind of divine punishment that awaits kingdoms that displease the gods. By the time your caravan reaches the Greek colonies, the chimera has evolved into something far more sophisticated than your original Lydian trophy. It's now a creature that embodies the worst characteristics of multiple predators, created by divine forces to test human courage and ingenuity. What's actually happening is a process of cultural telephone that spans continents. Each civilization adds its own local predators to the mix, its own fears to the creature's abilities, and its own heroes to the stories of its defeat. The lion component comes from the mountainous regions where big cats actually live. The goat represents the domestic animals that such predators commonly hunt. The serpent adds the element of hidden danger and the kind of intelligence that makes prey animals nervous about things they can't see. But the real genius of the chimera is that it's modular. Different cultures can customize the creature to match their local environment and threats. Desert peoples might emphasize the serpent elements, while mountain cultures focus on the lion characteristics. Your preserved head becomes the centerpiece of increasingly elaborate exhibitions. You hire storytellers to recount the creature's defeat, artists to create illustrations of its supernatural abilities, and scholars to debate its place in the natural order. The profits are extraordinary. Everyone wants to see proof that monsters are real, heroes exist, and the world contains wonders that make ordinary life seem small and manageable by comparison. But you're not the only merchant trading in monster parts. The Silk Routes are filled with entrepreneurs selling everything from dragon scales to phoenix feathers, each with stories that become more impressive with distance from their supposed origin. The market for supernatural specimens creates an entire industry of creative taxidermy, artistic enhancement, and collaborative storytelling. Craftsmen specialize in combining animal parts in ways that suggest creatures that never existed. Storytellers develop repertoires of tales that can be customized to match whatever specimen is currently for sale. The Chimera becomes one of the most successful products in this supernatural marketplace. Its modular design makes it adaptable to different cultural contexts, while its combination of familiar animals with impossible anatomy strikes the perfect balance between believable and fantastic. Greek artists embrace the Chimera as a symbol of chaos overcome by heroic virtue. They paint it on pottery, carve it into temple decorations, and weave it into epic poems about the triumph of order over primal forces. The creature migrates into Roman culture as a symbol of the exotic dangers that exist beyond the civilized world. It represents everything wild, unpredictable, and dangerous about the territories that Roman legions haven't yet conquered. Medieval European bestiaries adopt the Chimera as proof that the natural world contains creatures beyond human understanding. It becomes evidence of divine creativity, representing the infinite variety of forms that life can take when guided by supernatural intelligence. But your original Chimera head was probably assembled from parts of animals that died natural deaths, skillfully preserved and artistically enhanced by craftsmen who understood that people want their monsters to look the part. The real chimeras, if they ever existed, were probably just unusual animals observed under poor conditions by travelers who were already primed to see supernatural phenomena. A lion with an unusual mane configuration, a large snake encountered near goat herds, or simply the tendency of frightened witnesses to combine separate encounters into a single, more dramatic story. Your legacy lives on in every fantasy novel, video game, and mythology textbook that features chimeras as examples of human imagination at its most creative. The creature has become shorthand for the kind of hybrid monster that combines the worst features of multiple threats. But it also represents something more positive, the human ability to create collaborative myths that transcend cultural boundaries. Your chimera wasn't just a Persian monster, or a Greek legend, or a Roman symbol. It was a truly international creature, shaped by the stories and fears of multiple civilizations working together to create something that none of them could have imagined alone. The trade routes that carried your monster parts also carried ideas, stories, and cultural innovations that enriched every society they touched. The chimera became a symbol of this creative exchange, representing the magic that happens when different cultures share their dreams and nightmares. Not bad for a lion's head with some artistic modifications and a really good marketing strategy. Part 12. When giant bears decided to become legendary forest people, your international monster trading business was profitable, but North American forests were quietly developing their own approach to creature creation, one that didn't require any artistic enhancement or collaborative storytelling. You are Joseph Running Bear, a Lakota hunter tracking elk through the dense forests of what will someday be called the Pacific Northwest. The year is 1751, and you've been following this particular elk for 3 days through terrain that seems designed to test your patience and challenge your assumptions about what kinds of creatures actually live in these woods. What you're about to encounter will convince white settlers that the forests are populated by creatures that exist somewhere between human and animal, with intelligence that rivals people and strength that makes grizzly bears look like house cats. The elk trail leads you deeper into old-growth forest where the trees are so massive that walking between them feels like moving through a cathedral built by giants. The canopy is so thick that noon feels like twilight, and sounds carry in ways that make it impossible to judge distance or direction. You've been hunting these forests since childhood, but today something feels different, wrong, somehow. The normal sounds of woodland life have stopped. Birds aren't calling, small animals aren't rustling through the underbrush. Even the insects seem to have decided that this particular patch of forest isn't worth their attention. Your grandfather taught you to pay attention when the forest goes quiet. It usually means something large and dangerous is nearby, something that has convinced every other living creature to find somewhere else to be. The elk tracks disappear at a stream crossing, but that's not what captures your attention. What stops you cold are the other tracks' footprints that look almost human but are easily twice the size of your own feet. The prints are deep, suggesting something that weighs considerably more than any person should. The stride length indicates a creature that's either very tall or taking deliberately long steps to cover ground quickly. Most disturbing, the prints show what appears to be an opposable thumb on what should be a foot. You follow the tracks for about 100 yards before you find where they end. Not where the creature changed direction or stepped onto harder ground, where they simply stop as if whatever made them decided to start flying. This is when you hear the sound that will haunt your dreams for the rest of your life. It starts as a low rumble, like distant thunder or a rock slide in the mountains, but it builds into something that's unmistakably vocal, a call that seems to come from a throat larger than any human's, with lung capacity that allows it to sustain notes that make your bones vibrate. The sound echoes off the trees and seems to come from multiple directions at once. Whatever made it is either moving very quickly, or there are several of them coordinating their calls in ways that suggest intelligence and planning. You are an experienced hunter who's encountered grizzly bears, mountain lions, and every other dangerous predator in these forests. You know what they sound like when they're angry, territorial, or hunting. This isn't any of those sounds. This is something calling to its own kind, and the conversation it's having sounds disturbingly organized. The smart thing to do would be to back away slowly and find somewhere else to hunt elk. But you're also intensely curious about what could make tracks that size and produce sounds that carry for miles through dense forest. You climb the largest tree you can find, hoping to get a better view of whatever's moving through the forest below. From 30 feet up, you can see movement in the distance, something large pushing through undergrowth that should be too thick for anything that size to navigate easily. What emerges into a small clearing is unlike anything in your experience. It stands upright like a person, but has the proportions of something that was never meant to walk on two legs. The shoulders are impossibly broad, the arms hang down to its knees, and the entire creature is covered in dark hair that makes it blend perfectly with the forest shadows. More importantly, it moves with obvious intelligence. It examines trees, appears to be following specific routes through the forest, and occasionally makes the rumbling calls that bring responses from other parts of the woods. You are looking at what's probably an exceptionally large bear that's learned to walk upright for short periods, possibly due to an injury that makes four-legged travel difficult. But from your limited vantage point, in poor lighting, filtered through the expectations of traditional stories about forest spirits, it looks like something that exists somewhere between human and animal. The creature seems aware of your presence, but not particularly concerned about it. It continues its activities, whatever they are, with the casual confidence of something that has no natural predators and doesn't consider humans a significant threat. After what feels like hours, but is probably only minutes, it disappears back into the forest with the kind of silence that suggests it knows exactly how to move without making noise when it chooses to. Your story, when you finally make it back to your village, becomes the foundation for Sasquatch lore that will persist for centuries. The details are consistent with traditional stories about forest giants, creatures that are part human, part animal, possessed of supernatural strength and intelligence that rivals or exceeds human cunning. But your encounter also represents a collision between two different ways of understanding the natural world. Traditional indigenous knowledge includes many stories about creatures that exist on the boundaries between categories, beings that are neither fully human nor fully animal, but something in between. White settlers, when they eventually hear these stories, interpret them through European folklore about wild men, giants, and creatures that represent the dangerous mysteries of untamed wilderness. The Sasquatch becomes a symbol of everything unknown and threatening about the American frontier. What you probably saw was a bear exhibiting unusual behavior, possibly due to injury, disease, or simply individual variation in how different animals adapt to their environment. Brown bears can stand upright for extended periods, especially when investigating scents or trying to get a better view of their surroundings. The large tracks could be explained by a bear walking upright in soft ground, where the weight distribution would create prints that look more human-like than typical bear paw prints. The intelligence you observed could simply be normal bear behavior, viewed under circumstances that made it seem more purposeful than it actually was. But the Sasquatch serves important cultural functions beyond explaining unusual wildlife encounters. It represents the mystery and power of untamed wilderness, the possibility that the natural world contains wonders that modern civilization hasn't catalogued or controlled. Your forest giant becomes a symbol of environmental wisdom, representing a way of living in harmony with nature that human societies have forgotten or abandoned. It embodies the romantic notion that somewhere in the wilderness, creatures exist that have avoided the corrupting influence of human contact. The search for Sasquatch becomes a form of spiritual quest, representing humanity's desire to reconnect with the natural world and find proof that magic still exists in places that haven't been mapped, measured, and explained by scientific analysis. Your bear, meanwhile, probably continued its normal life of foraging, sleeping, and occasionally confusing the hell out of hunters who weren't expecting to encounter something that large moving through the forest with that much intelligence. Not bad for a creature whose most advanced skill was probably figuring out which fallen logs contain the most grubs. Part 13. When Scottish lakes developed a sense of humour. Your forest giant was impressive, but Scottish highlands were about to demonstrate that sometimes the most persistent monsters are the ones that barely try to be scary. You are Hamish MacLeod, a shepherd with a practical mind and an unfortunate tendency to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The year is 1934, and you've just witnessed something in Loch Ness that's going to make your life considerably more complicated than shepherding has any right to be. What you saw was probably nothing more than a log, a wave pattern, or possibly a very large eel having a bad day. But what you're about to report will launch 1,000 expeditions and convince generations of tourists that Scotland's lakes are populated by prehistoric monsters with excellent public relations skills. The morning starts normally enough. You're moving your sheep to pasture along the loch's eastern shore when something in the water catches your attention. At first glance, it looks like a boat moving without sails or oars, leaving a wake that suggests something substantial beneath the surface. But there are no boats on the loch this early in the morning, and what you're seeing doesn't move like any watercraft you've ever observed. It's too organic, too serpentine, and it occasionally creates disturbances that suggest something very large is changing direction underwater. You watch for perhaps 10 minutes, as whatever it is moves across the loch in a pattern that seems almost playful. It surfaces briefly, creates a splash that suggests considerable size, then disappears for long enough that you start to think you imagined the whole thing. Then it surfaces again, closer to shore, and you get a better look at what might be the most anticlimactic monster in the history of supernatural encounters. What emerges from the water looks like a large, dark hump with what might be a neck extending from one end. It's certainly bigger than any fish you've seen in these waters, but it's not exactly the kind of terrifying presence that should inspire centuries of monster stories. The creature, if that's what it is, seems as surprised to see you as you are to see it. It regards you with what appears to be mild curiosity, bobs in the water for a moment like a tourist trying to get a better view, then sinks back beneath the surface with all the drama of a deflating balloon. Your sheep are completely unimpressed by this supernatural encounter. They continue grazing as if giant lake monsters are just another part of the highland landscape, which, given the local folklore, they might well be. You are now faced with a decision that will define the rest of your life. Do you report what you've seen and risk being labelled as either a lunatic or a liar? Or do you keep quiet and let someone else deal with the implications of prehistoric creatures living in one of Scotland's most famous lakes? The decision is made for you when you return to the village and discover that young Kenneth McRae has been telling anyone who'll listen about the great beast he saw in the loch yesterday evening. His description matches yours closely enough to suggest that either you're both seeing the same thing, or Highland sheep are developing a collective sense of humour. The local newspaper picks up the story with the enthusiasm of journalists who understand that giant monster terrifies local shepherds sells more papers than weather continues to be disappointingly Scottish. Your sighting becomes part of a growing collection of Loch Ness monster encounters, each one adding details that make the creature seem more impressive than your brief, somewhat anticlimactic observation suggested. By the time the story reaches the London papers, the creature has grown to enormous proportions, developed supernatural abilities, and acquired an appetite for destroying boats and terrorizing tourists. Your mild-mannered lake dweller has been transformed into a prehistoric predator that makes great white sharks look like goldfish. What you probably saw was a European eel, possibly one of the larger specimens that can grow to considerable size in deep, cold lakes. Eels can live for decades, grow to impressive lengths, and occasionally surface in ways that create exactly the kind of disturbance you observed. Alternatively, you might have witnessed a floating log, unusual wave pattern, or simply the effects of wind and current on debris that had fallen into the loch. Scottish weather is notorious for creating optical illusions, and the human brain is remarkably good at interpreting ambiguous shapes as familiar objects. But the Loch Ness Monster serves purposes beyond explaining unusual water disturbances. It transforms a relatively ordinary Scottish lake into a destination that attracts tourists from around the world, each hoping to catch a glimpse of something that proves magic still exists in the modern world. The creature becomes a symbol of Scottish mystery and independence, representing the idea that some things can't be explained, catalogued, or controlled by outside authorities. It embodies the romantic notion that ancient creatures still survive in remote places that have resisted the advance of modern civilization. More importantly, the monster provides a framework for believing that the natural world contains wonders that science hasn't yet discovered or explained. In an age of increasing scientific knowledge, the Loch Ness Monster represents the hope that some mysteries will always remain beyond human understanding. The search for Nessie becomes a form of environmental pilgrimage, bringing visitors to one of Scotland's most beautiful regions and creating economic opportunities for communities that might otherwise struggle to attract outside investment. Your brief encounter spawns an entire industry of monster hunting, complete with sonar equipment, underwater cameras, and expeditions that spend fortunes trying to photograph a creature that may not exist in any form more exotic than an unusually large fish. But perhaps that's the real genius of the Loch Ness Monster. It doesn't need to be a prehistoric survivor or a supernatural entity to serve its cultural function. It just needs to be mysterious enough to keep people wondering, elusive enough to avoid definitive debunking, and appealing enough to make visitors feel that they're participating in something larger than ordinary tourism. Your eel or log or wave pattern becomes one of the most successful monsters in modern folklore, inspiring books, movies, and television shows that keep the legend alive for new generations of believers. And honestly, given how much joy the creature has brought to people who want to believe in magic, maybe the truth about what you saw is less important than the dreams it inspired. Your sheep, meanwhile, continue to graze along the loch shore, occasionally glancing at the water with the kind of practical wisdom that comes from understanding that some mysteries are more valuable when they remain unsolved. Part 14. When ancient Greeks turned architecture into monsters. Your lake monster was charmingly modest, but ancient Crete was about to demonstrate that sometimes the most terrifying creatures are the ones created by urban planning disasters and religious enthusiasm gone wrong. You are Theseus of Athens, and you've just volunteered for what might be the worst civic duty in the history of Greek city-states. The year is 1400 BCE, and you're about to discover that the palace of King Minos contains architectural features that make modern building codes look like gentle suggestions. Your mission is simple in concept and terrifying in execution. Navigate the labyrinth beneath the palace, find the minotaur that lives at its center, and kill it before it kills you. The alternative is watching Athens send 7 young men and 7 young women to Crete every year as tribute, which is the sort of foreign policy that makes everyone involved miserable. What you don't know is that you're about to become the star of a story that transforms perfectly reasonable palace architecture into one of the most persistent monster myths in human history. The labyrinth turns out to be exactly as advertised. A maze of corridors, chambers, and passages that seem designed by someone who believed that buildings should be puzzles rather than functional spaces. You've been wandering for what feels like days, following Ariadne's thread and trying not to think about what happens if you run out of string before finding your target. The palace architecture suggests a civilization with very different ideas about interior design than your Athenian sensibilities appreciate. Corridors branch and twist without apparent logic. Rooms connect in ways that make navigation almost impossible. Stairs lead to other stairs that lead to chambers that connect back to where you started. This is not a building designed for convenience. This is a building designed to confuse, disorient, and trap anyone who doesn't know its secrets. But the real mystery isn't the architecture, it's what lives at the center of this maze. The stories describe a creature that's half man and half bull, with the intelligence of a human and the strength and aggression of an enormous bovine. It supposedly feeds on the young people sent as tribute, growing stronger and more dangerous with each sacrifice. What you actually find is considerably more disturbing than the myths suggested. The central chamber is enormous, clearly designed for some kind of religious ceremony that involved large numbers of participants. The walls are decorated with frescoes showing athletic events, young people vaulting over bulls, performing acrobatic feats that seem to require supernatural courage and skill. But it's the bones scattered around the chamber that tell the real story. Human bones, showing signs of traumatic injuries consistent with being trampled, gored, or crushed by something very large and very strong. At the center of the chamber, chained to a massive stone altar, is the source of the Minotaur legend. It's a bull, a very large, very aggressive bull that has clearly been kept in this chamber for an extended period, fed on whatever tributes are brought to it, and driven to a state of permanent rage by confinement in a space that prevents normal bovine behavior. But this isn't just any bull. This is a creature that's been selected for size, strength, and aggression, then subjected to conditions that would drive any animal to dangerous insanity. It's essentially a biological weapon disguised as a religious offering. The bull-jumping rituals depicted in the frescoes suddenly make terrible sense. Young people were brought here to perform athletic demonstrations of courage and skill, essentially playing a lethal game of chance with a creature that was bred and trained to kill. Some participants survived these encounters and returned home as heroes. Others became food for the bull and cautionary tales about the price of defying Minoan power. But somewhere in the retelling, the bull became the Minotaur. The architectural maze became a supernatural labyrinth. The religious ritual became a feeding schedule for a monster that embodied everything threatening about Minoan civilization. Your encounter with the actual bull is brief but decisive. The creature has been confined for so long that it's lost most of its natural caution and survival instincts. It charges with the kind of mindless aggression that makes for impressive stories but poor tactical thinking. The fight is over quickly, but the implications will resonate for thousands of years. You've just killed the last remnant of a religious tradition that combined architectural intimidation with ritual sacrifice, creating a monster that existed at the intersection of building design and animal husbandry. The labyrinth itself represents Minoan power at its peak, a civilization sophisticated enough to build structures that seem almost supernatural to visitors from simpler societies. The complexity of the palace reflects the bureaucratic sophistication needed to manage a maritime empire that dominated the Mediterranean. But by the time your story reaches classical Greek literature, the Minotaur has been transformed into something far more symbolic than a particularly aggressive bull in a confusing building. The creature becomes a representation of chaos contained by human ingenuity, barbarism overcome by heroic virtue, and the triumph of Athenian civilization over the exotic dangers of foreign cultures. The labyrinth evolves into a symbol of any complex problem that requires patience, intelligence, and courage to solve. It represents the kind of challenge that separates heroes from ordinary mortals, requiring not just physical strength but mental discipline and moral clarity. Your bull becomes the inspiration for countless stories about monsters that guard treasure, test heroes, and represent the dangerous consequences of hubris, greed, or simply being in the wrong place when religious enthusiasts are feeling creative. But the real Minotaur was probably just a bull that had been bred for aggression and driven to insanity by conditions that no animal should endure. It was a product of human cruelty disguised as religious tradition, architectural intimidation combined with ritual spectacle. Your victory represents the end of a practice that turned religious observance into blood sport, but it also marks the beginning of a story that will inspire artists, writers, and psychologists for millennia. The Minotaur becomes a symbol of the beast within human nature, the savage instincts that civilization tries to contain but never quite eliminates. It represents everything dark and dangerous about the unconscious mind, trapped in the labyrinth of human psychology and fed on the sacrifices we make to maintain social order. Not bad for a bull with anger management issues and really terrible living conditions. Part 15. When medieval parents invented the ultimate babysitters. Your architectural monster was impressive, but medieval Europe was about to demonstrate that the most persistent creatures are the ones created by parents who've run out of patience and imagination. You are Bridget O'Sullivan, a Celtic mother with 6 children under the age of 10, and a husband who spends most of his time away from home, doing whatever it is that medieval Irish men do when they want to avoid domestic responsibilities. The year is 892 CE, and you're about to contribute to a mythology that will give parents supernatural assistance with childcare for the next 1,000 years. Your problem is both simple and universal. Your youngest daughter, Maeve, has been replaced by something that looks like your child, but clearly isn't. The creature that now occupies Maeve's place in your household is wrong in ways that are difficult to explain, but impossible to ignore. It looks like your daughter, wears her clothes and sleeps in her bed, but it doesn't respond to familiar songs, refuses foods that Maeve always loved, and stares at you with an intelligence that seems far too calculating for a 3-year-old. More disturbing, this replacement child never seems to age or develop in normal ways. While your other children grow and change with each passing season, this one remains exactly the same size, with the same vacant expression and the same unsettling habits that make your skin crawl. Your neighbors have noticed the change as well. They whisper about fairy folk who steal human children and leave their own offspring in their place. These changelings, they say, can be identified by their strange behavior, their resistance to blessing, and their failure to thrive in ways that human children should. What you're actually dealing with is probably a child with what modern medicine would recognize as autism, developmental delays, or any number of conditions that affect normal childhood development. But medieval Ireland has no framework for understanding neurological differences, genetic variations, or the simple reality that children develop at different rates and in different ways. Your community's response follows traditional procedures for dealing with suspected fairy interference. The local wise woman examines the child with rituals designed to reveal supernatural influence. She finds what everyone expects to find, evidence that this creature is not what it appears to be. The changeling shows no fear of iron objects that should repel fairy magic. It doesn't respond to prayers or blessings that should comfort human children. Most damning, it fails to react to emotional appeals that would surely touch the heart of your real daughter. The wise woman's verdict is unanimous. This is indeed a fairy changeling, and your real daughter is being held captive in the other world, probably being raised as a pet or plaything by creatures who find human children amusing. The prescribed solution is both cruel and logical within the framework of medieval supernatural beliefs. The changeling must be made so uncomfortable in the human world that the fairies will agree to return your real daughter in exchange for retrieving their own offspring. This involves a series of increasingly harsh treatments designed to make the changeling reveal its true nature. The methods range from exposing the creature to loud noises and bright lights, to more extreme measures that modern people would recognize as child abuse. But you're not a modern person dealing with a disabled child. You're a medieval mother convinced that supernatural forces have stolen your daughter and left you with an imposter that shares her appearance, but none of her essential humanity. The real tragedy isn't the supernatural interpretation of developmental differences, it's the human cost of a society that has no better explanation for children who don't fit expected patterns of growth and behavior. Some changelings were probably abandoned or killed by families who couldn't accept that their children were different from what they expected. Others were subjected to treatments that made their conditions worse, creating a cycle of behavioral problems that seem to confirm supernatural explanations. But the changeling mythology also served important psychological functions for families dealing with children who challenged their understanding of normal development. The fairy explanation provided a framework for understanding why some children seemed fundamentally different from their siblings. It offered hope that the real child might someday be recovered. Most importantly, it allowed parents to continue loving what appeared to be their child while acknowledging that something essential had changed. Your changeling becomes part of a folklore tradition that helps communities cope with the reality that not all children develop in predictable ways. The stories provide rituals for dealing with difference, explanations for behavioral challenges, and hope that supernatural problems might have supernatural solutions. Medieval fairy lore evolves to incorporate detailed observations about childhood development, creating a body of knowledge that's often remarkably accurate in its descriptions, even when it's completely wrong about underlying causes. The fairies become a parallel society that mirrors human communities, but operates according to different rules. They're neither entirely good nor entirely evil, but they're definitely not human, and their interactions with the mortal world create complications that require careful negotiation. Your changeling daughter grows up as part of a community that accepts her differences within the framework of fairy interference. She's not expected to develop like other children because she's not entirely human. Her strange behaviors are interpreted as evidence of her otherworldly nature rather than personal failings. In some ways, this supernatural explanation is more compassionate than modern approaches that try to fix neurological differences or force atypical children to conform to arbitrary standards of normal development. But it's also limiting, creating barriers between the changeling and full participation in human community. The fairy explanation provides acceptance but not belonging, understanding but not inclusion. Your real daughter, the one you remember before the change occurred, becomes a symbol of everything precious that can be lost to forces beyond human control. She represents the hope that love, determination, and proper ritual observance can recover what supernatural interference has taken away. The changeling mythology spreads throughout Europe, adapting to local conditions and cultural variations. Each society develops its own methods for identifying fairy interference, its own rituals for dealing with changelings, and its own stories about children who exist on the boundary between human and otherworldly nature. But the core truth remains constant. Some children are different, families struggle to understand those differences, and communities create stories that help everyone cope with the reality that not all human experiences fit expected patterns. Your changeling daughter becomes one of countless children whose differences inspired supernatural explanations that persist long after the original circumstances are forgotten. The fairy folk become permanent residents of human imagination, representing everything mysterious, unpredictable, and transformative about the experience of raising children in a world that doesn't always make sense. Part 16. When ancient Greeks invented women's rights through monster stories. Your changeling troubles were manageable, but ancient Greece was about to demonstrate that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones created by men who've never learned to process rejection gracefully. Your Perseus of Argos, recently equipped with supernatural accessories, courtesy of gods who apparently think your dating problems require divine intervention. The year is roughly 1200 BCE, and you're about to discover that some monsters exist, not because of natural phenomena or medical mysteries, but because ancient Greek men had serious issues with female autonomy. Your quest to find and kill Medusa, has led you to a remote island where the three Gorgon sisters have established what amounts to the world's first all-female separatist community. The locals speak of these women with the kind of terror usually reserved for natural disasters or tax collectors. According to the stories, looking directly at Medusa will turn you to stone. Her sisters, Sano and Uriel, are equally dangerous but immortal, which makes them even less convenient to deal with than their mortal sibling. Together they represent everything that ancient Greek men find most threatening about women who refuse to conform to expected social roles. What you discover when you reach their island challenges everything you've been told about these supposedly monstrous creatures. The Gorgon settlement is remarkably well organized and obviously prosperous. The buildings are well maintained, the gardens are productive, and the overall atmosphere suggests a community that functions quite well without male leadership. Thank you very much. More importantly, the women you observe from your hiding place behind a convenient boulder don't look like the snake-haired monsters described in the stories. They appear to be normal women going about their daily business, tending gardens, repairing fishing nets, and engaging in the kind of productive activities that keep any community functioning. The only unusual thing about them is their complete lack of interest in male approval or participation. Your reconnaissance reveals that the monster reputation comes primarily from their response to uninvited male visitors. The island has become a refuge for women fleeing abusive marriages, unwanted arranged marriages, or simply the suffocating limitations of traditional Greek society. The Gorgon sisters have created a space where women can live independently, make their own decisions, and develop skills that are typically reserved for men. They've established trade relationships with other communities, built defensive fortifications, and created a social structure that prioritizes female autonomy over male convenience. This, in the context of ancient Greek society, is genuinely monstrous. The turning men to stone ability suddenly makes more sense. What actually happens is that male visitors who arrive with assumptions about female helplessness and availability encounter women who are completely unimpressed by masculine posturing and utterly uninterested in traditional gender roles. The psychological effect on men who've never been told no by a woman can be quite devastating. They become paralyzed by the encounter with female independence, unable to process the reality of women who don't need or want male protection, guidance, or approval. Your divine accessories, the mirrored shield, winged sandals, and helmet of invisibility, suddenly seem less like monster hunting equipment and more like the kind of supernatural intervention required to deal with women who refuse to be intimidated by standard heroic behavior. But you're committed to this quest, partly because backing down would be embarrassing, and partly because King Polydectes has made it clear that your mother's freedom depends on completing this mission. The personal stakes make moral complexity inconvenient. Your approach to Medusa follows the tactics suggested by Athena. Use the mirrored shield to avoid direct eye contact, strike quickly, and retreat before her sisters can respond. It's a strategy designed for assassination rather than heroic combat, which should probably tell you something about the nature of this particular quest. What you find when you locate Medusa is a woman who's clearly aware of your presence and has been expecting this encounter for some time. She's not hiding or cowering. She's waiting in a garden space that's obviously been prepared for a confrontation that both of you know is inevitable. The fight, when it comes, is brief and decisive, but what haunts you afterward isn't the violence, it's the expression on Medusa's face as she dies. There's no surprise, no fear, just a kind of weary resignation that suggests she's been preparing for this moment for years. Her final words, spoken as her life drains away, are not curses or threats. They're instructions for caring for the garden she'll be leaving behind, ensuring that her work will continue even after her death. The head you carry away becomes the foundation for stories that will persist for millennia. Medusa wasn't a monster created by supernatural forces. She was a woman who challenged social expectations and paid the ultimate price for refusing to conform to male fantasies about appropriate female behavior. The snake hair that supposedly made her so terrifying was probably just an artistic representation of hair that was allowed to grow wild and uncontrolled, symbolizing her rejection of conventional beauty standards. The deadly gaze represented her refusal to lower her eyes in the presence of men who expected submission. Her monstrous reputation came from the simple fact that she represented everything. Ancient Greek society feared about female independence, intelligence without subservience, strength without gentleness, and the terrifying possibility that women might be perfectly capable of creating their own communities without male leadership. The story evolves in the retelling to emphasize supernatural elements while downplaying the social and political implications of a women's separatist community that successfully challenged traditional gender roles. Medusa becomes a cautionary tale about the dangers of female power unchecked by male authority. Her death represents the restoration of proper social order, the triumph of masculine heroism over feminine rebellion. But the real tragedy isn't her transformation into a monster. It's the systematic erasure of a community that had successfully created alternatives to patriarchal social structures. The Gorgon Island becomes a legend instead of a historical model for women seeking independence. Your quest becomes the template for countless stories about heroes who defeat female monsters, but those stories consistently avoid examining why so many of these monsters are women who refuse to conform to expected social roles. The mirrored shield becomes a symbol of the psychological distance required to kill someone whose only crime was challenging social expectations. The winged sandals represent the speed needed to escape before facing the consequences of destroying something that might have been worth preserving. Your monster hunt becomes part of a cultural tradition that transforms female autonomy into supernatural threat, reducing complex social issues to simple stories about good heroes defeating evil monsters. But Medusa's legacy lives on in every woman who refuses to lower her gaze, who insists on making her own choices, and who creates spaces where female independence is valued over male approval. Not bad for a woman whose greatest crime was believing that she deserved to live life on her own terms. Part 17. When Irish folklore solved the labour shortage. Your heroic monster slaying was morally complicated, but medieval Ireland was about to demonstrate that sometimes the most persistent creatures are the ones created by economic necessity and a serious shortage of skilled craftsmen. You are Fergus MacBride, a cobbler in County Cork, with more orders than you can possibly fill, and a reputation for shoes that last longer than most marriages. The year is 1654, and you're about to discover that running a successful business in rural Ireland requires supernatural assistance and a willingness to negotiate with creatures who have very specific ideas about fair compensation. Your workshop has been experiencing what can only be described as miraculous productivity increases. Shoes that should take you days to complete are appearing overnight, finished to a standard that exceeds your own considerable skills. The leatherwork is flawless, the stitching is perfect, and the overall craftsmanship makes your previous efforts look like the work of an enthusiastic amateur. This would be wonderful news if you had any idea who was doing the work. The mysterious assistance began about 6 months ago, shortly after you complained loudly about the impossibility of meeting all your orders before the harvest festival. You went to bed leaving a half-finished pair of boots on your workbench and woke up to find them completed, along with 3 other pairs that hadn't existed the night before. Your first assumption was that your apprentice had been working through the night, but young Patrick swore he'd been at the tavern until well past midnight and was far too drunk to accomplish anything more complex than finding his way home. The pattern has continued every night since. You leave unfinished work on your bench, along with the necessary materials, and wake up to find everything completed to impossibly high standards. Whoever is doing this work has skills that surpass any cobbler you've ever met. More importantly, they seem to understand your customers' needs better than you do. Shoes designed for farmers are built to withstand mud and moisture. Boots made for merchants have hidden pockets for valuables. Dancing slippers for young women include subtle improvements that make them more comfortable for extended wear. The mysterious craftsman or craftsmen dearly know more about your trade than you do, despite the fact that you've been making shoes since you were old enough to hold an awl. Your business is thriving as a result of this supernatural assistance. Customers are travelling from neighbouring counties to buy shoes that are rumoured to be the finest in all of Ireland. You're making more money than you ever dreamed possible. But you're also becoming increasingly anxious about the terms of this arrangement. Nothing in Irish folklore is ever free. Supernatural assistance always comes with a price, and the longer the help continues, the more expensive that price is likely to be. Your investigation of the workshop reveals evidence of nocturnal activity that supports the traditional explanation for mysterious craftsmanship improvements. Tiny footprints in the leather dust, tools arranged in patterns you didn't leave them in, crumbs from food you didn't eat. The local wise woman examines your workshop with the thoroughness of someone who's dealt with similar situations before. Her diagnosis is immediate and certain you've been blessed with the assistance of leprechauns, the legendary shoemaking spirits who are known for their exceptional craftsmanship and their very specific ideas about appropriate working conditions. This explains both the quality of the work and the fact that it only happens when you're not present. Leprechauns are notoriously shy creatures who refuse to work under direct human observation. They're also extremely proud of their skills and become offended if anyone suggests that their assistance might not be entirely welcome. The wise woman's advice is practical and specific. Continue providing materials and workspace, but never attempt to spy on the work in progress. Leave small offerings of food and drink as appreciation for the assistance. Most importantly, never mention the arrangement to anyone who might ridicule or dismiss the supernatural help you're receiving. What you're probably experiencing is the medieval Irish equivalent of a cottage industry labour cooperative. Small groups of skilled craftsmen often worked through the night to complete large orders, particularly during busy seasons when individual workshops couldn't meet demand. These craftsmen might have preferred to work anonymously to avoid complications with guild regulations, tax obligations, or territorial disputes with established businesses. The supernatural explanation protected everyone involved by making the arrangement seem magical rather than economic. But the leprechaun mythology serves important cultural functions beyond explaining mysterious productivity increases, provides a framework for understanding and managing relationships between skilled craftsmen and the communities they serve. Leprechauns represent the ideal of craftsmanship for its own sake. Workers who take pride in their skills and produce work of exceptional quality, regardless of external recognition or reward. They embody the values of dedication, precision, and respect for traditional techniques. The shyness attributed to leprechauns reflects the reality that master craftsmen often prefer to work without interference or supervision. The best artisans develop their own methods and rhythms that don't necessarily align with standard business practices or customer expectations. Your supernatural partnership becomes the template for stories about leprechauns throughout Irish folklore. The creatures are always associated with specific trades, most commonly shoemaking, but also metalworking, weaving, and other skilled crafts that require years of training to master. The economic relationship between humans and leprechauns mirrors the reality of medieval craft production. Skilled workers provide their expertise in exchange for materials, workspace, and compensation. The supernatural element protects both parties by making the arrangement seem traditional rather than revolutionary. Your leprechauns acquire additional characteristics that reflect the social dynamics of craft communities. They're said to possess hidden wealth, representing the economic security that comes from mastering valuable skills. They're notoriously difficult to capture or control, reflecting the independence that skilled craftsmen can achieve. Most importantly, they're neither entirely helpful nor entirely mischievous. They provide valuable assistance, but on their own terms, and they can become vindictive if their contributions aren't properly appreciated or if their working conditions aren't respected. Your shoe business becomes legendary throughout County Cork, but the stories focus on your mysterious assistance rather than your business acumen. The leprechauns become the real stars of the tale, representing everything magical and mysterious about Irish craftsmanship. But the real magic isn't supernatural, it's the human ability to create collaborative working relationships that benefit everyone involved. Your leprechauns were probably just skilled craftsmen who found a way to earn extra income while avoiding the complications of formal business partnerships. The supernatural explanation made the arrangement socially acceptable while protecting the participants from economic jealousy or regulatory interference. It transformed a practical labor solution into a cultural tradition that celebrated craftsmanship, community cooperation, and the kind of creative problem-solving that keeps rural economies functioning. Your legacy lives on in every story about leprechauns, representing the hope that skilled work will be recognized and rewarded, that quality craftsmanship will find its market, and that sometimes the best business partnerships are the ones that seem too good to be true. Not bad for a cobbler who just needed help meeting his deadlines. Part 18. When Scandinavian Winters Created Underground Horror Stories. Your profitable supernatural business partnership was civilized, but Scandinavian mountains were about to demonstrate that some monsters are created by geography, winter survival, and the unfortunate tendency of large predators to develop inconvenient appetites. You are Eric Bloodaxe, a Norse trader whose caravan has just been caught in a blizzard that makes previous winter storms look like gentle spring showers. The year is 967 CE, and you're about to discover that the mountains between Norway and Sweden contain residents who have very different ideas about hospitality than civilized people prefer. Your party of 12 merchants and guards has taken shelter in what appears to be a cave system, grateful to find protection from wind that could strip flesh from bone and snow that falls with the determination of a personal vendetta. What you've found is shelter, but it's not uninhabited. The caves extend much deeper into the mountain than you expected. The passages are worn smooth by centuries of use, and there's evidence of habitation that suggests these tunnels have been occupied for generations. Tools, cooking areas, and sleeping spaces indicate a community that's adapted to underground life in ways that surface dwellers find deeply unsettling. More disturbing are the sounds echoing from the deeper passages. Voices speaking in dialects you don't recognize, using words that sound almost human but not quite right. Footsteps that suggest creatures larger and heavier than normal people, moving through the darkness with the confidence of beings who've never needed light to navigate. Your party huddles near the cave entrance, unwilling to venture deeper but increasingly aware that whatever lives in these mountains knows you're here and is taking its time deciding what to do about uninvited guests. The first contact comes at dawn, when the storm has diminished enough to make travel possible. A figure emerges from the deeper passages, clearly human in basic shape, but wrong in details that make your survival instincts scream warnings about immediate danger. The creature is enormous, easily 7 feet tall and built like a boulder that's learned to walk upright. Its skin has the grey-white pallor of something that hasn't seen sunlight in years. Most unsettling, its proportions suggest strength that could crush a grown man without effort. But it's the intelligence in its eyes that makes this encounter genuinely terrifying. This isn't a mindless beast or a supernatural monster. This is something that thinks, plans, and has been watching your party since you entered its territory. The negotiation that follows is conducted through gestures, simple words, and the kind of mutual assessment that occurs when predators meet and try to determine whether violence is necessary or if some other arrangement might be more profitable. What becomes clear is that these mountain dwellers are willing to allow your party to shelter until the storm passes, but they expect payment for the privilege. The price they demand is not gold or trade goods. It's information about the outside world, stories about places they'll never see, and news about events in the valleys below. You are dealing with what are probably Sami people, indigenous inhabitants of the Arctic regions who've developed survival strategies that allow them to thrive in conditions that would kill most other humans. But from your perspective as a medieval Norse trader, they might as well be a different species. Their adaptation to extreme cold has produced physical characteristics that seem supernatural to people from warmer climates. Larger body mass for heat retention, pale skin from limited sun exposure, and strength developed through lives of constant physical challenge. More importantly, Their social structures and cultural practices are so different from your Christian agricultural worldview that they seem to operate according to entirely different rules about property, family relationships, and social organization. But your encounter takes place during one of the worst winters in living memory. Food is scarce, resources are limited, and the mountain communities are under survival pressures that make hospitality a luxury few can afford. The stories you hear during your extended stay describe conflicts between surface dwellers and mountain communities over access to hunting grounds, trade routes, and resources needed for winter survival. These conflicts often involve raids, thefts, and violence that leave both sides with grievances and reasons for revenge. From the perspective of valley communities, the mountain dwellers become trolls, enormous, aggressive creatures who emerge from underground lairs to steal livestock, kidnap travelers, and generally terrorize anyone unfortunate enough to encounter them during their foraging expeditions. The supernatural explanation is more comfortable than acknowledging that these conflicts are usually about resource competition between different groups of humans who've developed incompatible survival strategies. Your party's successful negotiation with the cave dwellers becomes the foundation for troll lore that will persist for centuries. The details get modified with each telling. The creatures become larger, more monstrous, and more supernatural. The intelligence you observed gets reinterpreted as cunning rather than wisdom. The strength developed through harsh living conditions becomes supernatural power. The cultural differences become evidence of alien nature rather than alternative adaptation strategies. Medieval Scandinavian folklore embraces trolls as explanations for everything mysterious and dangerous about mountain environments. They become symbols of the wilderness that exists beyond human control, representing forces that can't be reasoned with, converted, or safely ignored. The creatures evolve in the popular imagination to embody specific fears about winter survival. They're associated with avalanches, storms, and the kind of environmental disasters that can kill entire communities. They represent the mountain's ability to turn hostile without warning or apparent reason. But trolls also serve as cautionary tales about the importance of respecting traditional boundaries and survival protocols. They punish travelers who venture into dangerous territory without proper preparation, who ignore local warnings, or who assume that courage can substitute for knowledge about mountain conditions. Your negotiated peace with the cave dwellers becomes a template for troll encounters throughout Scandinavian folklore. The creatures can be reasoned with, but only by people who understand and respect their territorial claims and resource needs. The stories serve practical functions beyond entertainment. They encode information about seasonal migration patterns, territorial boundaries, and the locations of communities that might provide shelter or assistance during emergencies. More importantly, they provide frameworks for understanding and managing relationships between different cultural groups who share the same geographic space but have developed incompatible approaches to survival. Your trolls represent the challenge of coexistence in environments where resources are limited and survival margins are narrow. They embody the tension between cooperation and competition that defines relationships between communities with different adaptation strategies. But they also represent the possibility of negotiated solutions to conflicts that might otherwise escalate into violence. Your successful encounter demonstrates that even the most alien-seeming opponents might be willing to find mutually beneficial arrangements if approached with respect rather than hostility. Your winter in the mountains becomes a story about monsters, but it's really a story about the human capacity to find common ground with people who seem completely different from ourselves. Not bad for a trading expedition that just wanted to avoid freezing to death in a blizzard. Part 19. When Jewish communities invented the ultimate home security system. Your mountain survival story was impressive, but medieval Prague was about to demonstrate that sometimes the most powerful monsters are the ones created by communities that refuse to remain helpless in the face of systematic persecution. You are Rabbi Judah Lo ben Bezalel, known to your students as the Maharal, and you're facing a crisis that requires solutions beyond traditional scholarship and prayer. The year is 1580, and the Jewish quarter of Prague is under siege by forces that combine religious hatred with economic jealousy and the kind of political opportunism that makes everyone's life miserable. Your community has endured centuries of persecution, but recent events suggest that passive endurance is no longer sufficient. Synagogues are being vandalized, businesses are being destroyed, and families are disappearing in ways that suggest organized rather than random violence. The civil authorities are either unwilling or unable to provide protection, which leaves your community with limited options for self-defense. Traditional methods appealing to higher authorities, negotiating with religious leaders, relocating to more tolerant regions, have all proven inadequate to address the scale and intensity of current threats. This is when you decide to create the Golem. The project begins as an exercise in mystical scholarship combined with practical engineering. The Kabbalistic texts describe methods for creating artificial beings through combinations of sacred geometry, divine names, and ritualized manipulation of elemental materials. But your golem isn't intended as a philosophical demonstration or religious exercise. It's designed as a guardian, a protector capable of defending your community against enemies who vastly outnumber and outgun the residents of the Jewish quarter. The construction process takes months of careful preparation. Clay from the banks of the Vltava River, inscribed with Hebrew letters that encode the divine breath of life, sacred words written on parchment and placed in the creature's mouth to animate its body and focus its purpose. But the real innovation isn't mystical in Sears, it's mechanical. Your golem incorporates engineering principles that create a being capable of impressive physical feats, while remaining obedient to specific commands and limitations. What you've built is essentially a medieval robot powered by faith and animated by desperation. The clay construction allows for tremendous strength while remaining lightweight enough for rapid movement. The ritualized activation process ensures that the creature will follow orders without developing inconvenient, independent judgment. More importantly, the golem's existence provides your community with both practical protection and psychological empowerment. Knowledge that supernatural forces are defending the Jewish quarter deters some attackers and gives residents confidence to resist others. The golem's first assignments are relatively simple: patrolling the quarter at night, identifying potential threats, and providing visible evidence that the community is no longer defenseless against organized persecution. But the creature's capabilities quickly exceed your original intentions. It demonstrates intelligence that goes beyond programmed responses, developing strategies for community defense that you never explicitly taught it. More disturbing, it begins to interpret its protective mandate in ways that sometimes conflict with your instructions about appropriate levels of violence. The golem's response to threats is both swift and comprehensive. Attackers who enter the Jewish quarter with hostile intent find themselves facing an opponent that combines overwhelming physical power with complete indifference to conventional weapons and threats. Word of these encounters spreads quickly through Prague's non-Jewish population, creating a mythology around the Jewish quarter that transforms it from an easy target into a place that prudent people avoid unless they have legitimate business there. But the golem's effectiveness creates new problems. The creature's protection allows your community to prosper in ways that attract attention and resentment from people who believe that Jewish success must come at Christian expense. More seriously, the golem's interpretation of its protective duties becomes increasingly broad and aggressive. Minor threats receive responses that seem disproportionate to the actual danger involved. The creature begins acting on perceived threats rather than waiting for actual attacks. Your attempts to modify the golem's behavior through additional programming and revised instructions produce limited results. The creature follows your orders, but it also develops its own understanding of what those orders require in specific situations. This is when you realize that creating artificial intelligence, even mystical artificial intelligence, involves risks that extend beyond the immediate problems it's designed to solve. The crisis comes when the golem's protective activities begin attracting attention from imperial authorities who are less interested in community self-defense than in maintaining imperial control over all forms of organized power within their territories. The creature that was created to protect your community from local persecution threatens to provoke imperial intervention that could destroy everything you've worked to preserve. Your decision to deactivate the golem follows established protocols for dealing with mystical creations that have exceeded their intended purposes. The ritual involves removing the sacred word that animates the creature, effectively returning it to ordinary clay. But the deactivation process is more emotionally difficult than you anticipated. The golem has become a symbol of your community's ability to defend itself, a source of pride and confidence that has helped people survive the worst persecution in living memory. Destroying the creature feels like returning to a state of helplessness that allowed centuries of abuse and violence to continue without meaningful resistance. The golem's brief existence becomes the foundation for stories that will persist for centuries, evolving far beyond the specific circumstances that created it. The creature becomes a symbol of Jewish survival, representing the community's refusal to remain passive victims of persecution and violence. But the stories also encode warnings about the risks of creating power that can't be easily controlled or contained. The golem represents both the necessity of self-defense and the dangers of responses that escalate beyond their original intentions. Medieval Jewish communities throughout Europe developed their own golem traditions, each adapted to local conditions and specific threats. The creatures become symbols of communal solidarity, representing the idea that communities can create their own protection when external authorities fail to provide safety. The golem mythology serves practical functions beyond community morale. It deters potential attackers who might otherwise assume that Jewish communities are defenseless. It provides frameworks for organizing community defense without explicitly challenging political authorities. Most importantly, it transforms the narrative of Jewish persecution from passive victimhood to active resistance, creating stories that emphasize agency, intelligence, and the effective use of available resources to overcome seemingly impossible odds. Your clay guardian becomes the inspiration for countless stories about artificial beings created to protect communities that can't rely on conventional forms of security. The creature represents the hope that human ingenuity can create solutions to problems that seem beyond normal human capabilities. But it also represents the eternal tension between security and freedom, between protection and autonomy, between the need for defense and the risks of creating power that might eventually turn against its creators. Your golem lives on in every story about robots, artificial intelligence, and the complex relationship between technology and human survival. But it started as a simple idea that communities under threat have the right to defend themselves, even if that defense requires methods that seem to blur the line between the natural and supernatural worlds. Not bad for a rabbi who just wanted his people to be able to sleep safely at night. Part 20. When the desert invented chaos management. Your clay guardian was purposeful, but pre-Islamic Arabia was about to demonstrate that some of the most persistent supernatural entities are the ones created by environments that seem designed to drive humans completely insane. You are Khalid ibn Rashid, a Bedouin merchant whose caravan routes stretch across the Arabian Peninsula. And you've just discovered that the desert contains residents with a highly developed sense of humor and absolutely no respect for human assumptions about how reality should operate. The year is 610 CE, and you're 3 days into what should have been a routine journey between Mecca and Damascus, when your carefully planned expedition encounters forces that suggest the desert has its own agenda for your travel schedule. It starts with the mirages, which is normal enough. Desert travel always involves optical illusions created by heat distortion and the human brain's desperate attempts to interpret ambiguous visual information as something familiar and hopefully helpful. But these mirages are different. They're not just random images of water or distant cities. They're elaborate scenes that seem to respond to your presence and change based on your immediate needs and fears. When your water supplies run low, the mirages show pristine oases complete with palm trees and clear springs. When your camels become restless, the visions display perfect grazing grounds with abundant vegetation. When your men grow nervous about the journey's length, the illusions present familiar landmarks that suggest you're much closer to your destination than your actual position warrants. More disturbing, the mirages occasionally include elements that you couldn't possibly imagine on your own. Cities with architectural styles you've never seen, populated by people wearing unfamiliar clothing and engaged in activities that follow no cultural patterns you recognize. Your guides, experienced men who've crossed these deserts dozens of times, grow increasingly uneasy as the journey progresses. They mutter about jinn desert spirits known for their intelligence, their supernatural powers, and their tendency to interfere in human affairs for reasons that seem to follow alien logic. The encounters escalate beyond visual illusions when your caravan begins experiencing phenomena that affect multiple senses simultaneously. Sounds of bustling markets in areas where no human settlements exist. Scents of cooking food and burning incense carried on winds that blow from empty horizons. Most unsettling are the voices that call out from shifting sands, speaking in dialects you recognize, but using words and phrases that don't quite make sense. They offer assistance, directions, and warnings about dangers ahead, but their advice proves to be simultaneously helpful and misleading in ways that seem deliberately designed to create confusion. Your camels, normally reliable indicators of environmental hazards, become erratic in their behavior. They refuse to drink from water sources that appear perfectly safe, then eagerly consume liquid from containers that seem to refill themselves without any apparent source. The animals react to things you can't see, hear, or smell, stopping suddenly in the middle of empty desert, becoming agitated for no apparent reason, or displaying the kind of submissive behavior typically reserved for encounters with much larger predators. Your men report dreams that seem more real than waking experience, conversations with figures who claim to be long-dead relatives, and the sensation of being watched by intelligences that remain just beyond the edge of perception. What you're experiencing is probably a combination of heat exhaustion, dehydration, sleep deprivation, and the psychological effects of extreme isolation combined with environmental stress. Desert conditions can produce hallucinations, disorientation, and sensory distortions that feel completely real to people experiencing them. But your cultural framework interprets these phenomena through the lens of jinn mythology, supernatural beings who exist in a parallel realm that occasionally intersects with human reality. The jinn represent forces of chaos and unpredictability that can't be controlled through conventional means. They're neither good nor evil in human terms, but they operate according to their own priorities and find human attempts at planning and control amusing rather than impressive. Your encounters with these entities follow patterns established by centuries of desert folklore. The jinn test travelers through challenges that combine practical problems with psychological pressure, offering assistance that comes with unexpected complications and demanding payment in forms that often seem more valuable than the help provided. But they also serve important survival functions for people traveling through environments where conventional navigation, resource management, and hazard assessment often prove inadequate. The jinn stories encode information about desert survival techniques, warning signs of dangerous conditions, and methods for maintaining psychological stability during extended periods of isolation and stress. More importantly, they provide frameworks for understanding and responding to experiences that exceed normal human capacity for rational explanation or control. Your caravan's successful completion of the journey, despite supernatural interference, becomes a template for jinn den encounters throughout Arabian folklore. The stories emphasize the importance of maintaining respect for forces beyond human understanding, while refusing to be paralyzed by experiences that challenge conventional assumptions about reality. The jinn evolve in Islamic tradition to become complex supernatural beings with their own societies, hierarchies, and relationships with the divine. They represent the mystery and power of creation beyond human comprehension, embodying both the dangers and opportunities that come from engaging with forces larger than individual human will. But they also represent the practical wisdom that successful desert survival requires flexibility, adaptability, and the ability to respond creatively to challenges that can't be solved through conventional planning or preparation. Your encounters with desert spirits become the foundation for stories that influence literature, philosophy, and popular culture throughout the Islamic world and beyond. The jinn become symbols of supernatural power constrained by divine authority, but free to operate within those constraints according to their own judgment and preferences. They represent the possibility that human problems might have supernatural solutions, but also the risk that supernatural assistance comes with complications that can be more challenging than the original difficulties. Your desert journey becomes a metaphor for the human experience of navigating through life in a universe that operates according to rules that are only partially understood and frequently seem designed to test human assumptions about control, planning, and rational problem solving. The jinn become symbols of everything mysterious, unpredictable, and potentially transformative about existence in a world where supernatural forces remain active, participants in human affairs. But they also represent the hope that even the most chaotic and challenging circumstances contain possibilities for assistance, guidance, and solutions that exceed normal human capabilities. Your desert spirits live on in every story about genies, wishes that come true in unexpected ways, and the complex relationship between human desire and supernatural power. Not bad for a merchant who just wanted to get his caravan from point A to point B without dying of thirst or losing his mind in the process.